Everyone thought Minato's flying RAIJIN was just an incredible jutsu. They were wrong. It was a bloodline limit, hidden within the Namikaze family all along. When Naruto awakens it as a child, speed stops being an advantage and becomes a weapon. One flash, one strike, and the battlefield is already over. They called Minato the Yellow Flash. Naruto is about to become something even faster. The Flash Fire, Chapter 11. Hidden Stone Village, 2 weeks before biannual Chunin exams. Inoki of the Twin Scales looked up from the report he just finished reading and said, "Is this report accurate?" His granddaughter nodded and said, "I just came back with my team from the town Lord Tsuchikage. It's accurate. There is a child of an Uzumaki survivor serving as a jounin for the Leaf Village. And as you can see, he looks like the Yondaime Hokage. Not only that, rumor around the village we were in says that he's able to disappear in one spot and reappear in another instantly." Inoki frowned in thought before he looked back down at the report and said, "This could be very bad if the wrong people find out about it. We may even go to war if this Uzumaki is in fact a descendant of Namikaze. And it would be one hell of a scandal if this turns out to be some Yamanaka that was banished from his clan." Kuratsuchi frowned as she considered everything her grandfather said and the consequences they could bring. Looking her grandfather in the eye, she said, "Sir, permission to lead a genin team to the Leaf Village and conduct a fact-finding mission under the cover of my team taking the exams." Inoki studied his granddaughter for a minute before he looked back down at the report, which showed a whiskered blonde holding a kunai in a reverse grip with the kunai inside some rough-looking guy while another boy used a senbon needle to block the sword of another bandit. "What do we have on this other boy?" Inoki asked, changing the topic. Kuratsuchi shrugged and said, "Not much. We know that he is capable of using ice-style jutsu with an ease that suggests that he has a bloodline. We also know that he became Uzumaki's partner after he found him in the Land of Waves. I'm afraid that's it though." Inoki frowned again before he sighed and said, "This will require more than one team to be sent." Looking up, he said, "I'm sending 3 teams. You are to be in overall charge of all 3. Find out everything you possibly can about this Uzumaki kid. Secondary importance is his partner. I don't believe I have to tell you to take note of everything you can while you're in the village. I'll send you the team files tonight for you to choose which teams will be going." Kuratsuchi nodded and bowed before she walked out and closed the door behind her. Scene change, Hidden Leaf Village, Hokage's office. 1 week and 3 days until Chunin exams. "You needed to see us, sir?" Sarutobi looked up from the scroll he was reading at the sound of Haku's voice and gave a tired smile at the Jounin/Chunin team that was suddenly in front of him and said, "Yes, Haku, I did. I'm afraid that I have some bad news. Fortunately, I also have some unexpected good news for you as well, Naruto. Please, you two have a seat." The 2 boys took a seat as Sarutobi pulled a file towards him and opened it as he said, "4 days ago, one of Jiraiya's multiple village information gathering agency, Vega, contacts sent us a message that he had given some intel to Stone Nin that we should really know about." Haku frowned and said, "Excuse me, Lord Hokage, for interrupting, but what is a multiple village information gathering agency?" "Well, to put it simply, it's a loose group of people who gather information about all of the villages and sells that information to whoever pays for their services." Haku frowned and said, "Why would a village allow something like that? Never mind pay for it?" "Because these people usually have the best intelligence and they act as an equalizer. If one village has a piece of extremely important information that was sold to them by these people, you can always assume that the village it concerns will know about it sooner rather than later. The group prevents wars from breaking out by mainly telling their clients about coup attempts and alliances that are made. Now, as I was saying, one of the agents sold information to Stone that I think you two should know about. Primarily you, Naruto. Take a look at this picture and tell me if you recognize it." Sarutobi picked up a picture from the file and tossed it like a shuriken to Naruto, who caught it and looked at it while Haku leaned over and looked as well. The picture showed Naruto with a kunai in a reverse grip stabbed into the chest of a guy who could pass for a bouncer, while Haku was behind him with his back to the blonde as he held back a sword with one of his senbon needles. Naruto frowned as he said, "This looks like it was taken during that mission we had last month to clear out that mafia group." Flashback. 1 month ago. Border village between Land of Fire and Land of Vegetables. Their mission was simple. A mafia gang had set up shop in the town and had been receiving international taxes from anyone who was using the village to make the crossing over from one country to another. They were to go in, find the base, take all the gang members out of commission, and leave their unconscious bodies in the hands of the joint police force for some well-deserved one-on-one interrogation on other criminal groups in the area. There was just one slight hitch in the plan. The day Naruto and Haku had reached the village, the whole mafia gang had for some reason decided to have some fun at the police station, and a massive fight currently made walking around in that area of the village a hazard to a normal person's health. When they reached the police station, Naruto and Haku took 5 seconds to figure out what was going on and to run a quick IFF. After that, the fight turned into true organized chaos as Naruto slipped into the slipstream and began knocking people out by putting burns over the parts of the body that were the most sensitive to pain or just chopping the back of their necks, while Haku made a bunch of ice senbon needles and began putting everyone in range in death-like states as he began wading his way towards the police officers. The fight was pretty much over the minute the two-leaf shinobi showed up. But as Haku blocked an overhead slash from a sword-wielding thug with a senbon needle, Naruto saw one of his victims regain consciousness and narrow his eyes at Haku before he sprung up to his feet with a switchblade flicking open. Naruto's own eyes narrowed before he disappeared and reappeared with a kunai already in the man's chest. "Should have stayed down," Naruto growled out as the man gurgled and fell to the floor. Naruto took his kunai out and called one of the policemen over. As the man rushed over to him and his victim, he said, "If you get him some first aid as soon as possible, he'll survive." The officer nodded and called over one of the rapid response officers who quickly got to work on the thug. Naruto turned around and looked back to where Haku had been and saw his opponent currently on the ground whimpering while he held one of his more fragile body parts while Haku stood over him. Naruto shook his head and thought, "I keep forgetting how harsh Haku can be when he's not forced to kill someone." Haku sensed Naruto's gaze and turned around and gave a smile at Naruto, causing the jounin to sweat drop at how sweet the smile looked. End flashback. Unfortunately, the agency took that picture and sold a copy of it, and information that was fortunately just rumor to Stone. The agent who gave us that picture says that they didn't tell them about who they thought your parents were since they knew that would definitely start a war. Still, it's not hard to guess that Stone will work it out. In fact, we believe that at least someone already has. I've just received a message from the Tsuchikage. For the first time since the Chunin exams first came into existence, Stone is sending teams to the Hidden Leaf Village for the exams. 3 of them, in fact. Naruto frowned and said, "Isn't there some treaty or something that prevents them from coming?" Sarutobi shook his head and said, "There was never actually anything legal preventing enemy villages from coming to one another's exams. It was just simply one of those things that villages don't do because of the relationship they have with each other. Stone is simply taking advantage of that fact in an effort to get information. Most likely so that they can either confirm or dismiss their theory on who Naruto's father is." Naruto's frown grew as he said, "In that case, me and Haku should probably take a long-term mission and stay out of the village until the exams are over. Sorry, old man, but it looks like you'll have to find someone else to proctor the 3rd exam. Actually, Naruto, I still want you to proctor the exam. If we try to hide you and Haku until the exams are over, that just shows Stone how much we want to keep you out of their sights, and they would be all that more determined to find out the truth. No, as much as I don't want to, we have to act like we don't know why Stone is suddenly sending teams to the exams." Naruto sighed before he looked up and said, "You said you had some good news, old man?" Sarutobi nodded as he allowed a smile to form on his face and pressed the button on his intercom. Leaning in slightly towards it, he said, "Mrs. Reynas, could you please send our guests back in?" His secretary's voice came through the speaker in its gentle tone. "At once, Lord Hokage. Fair warning, sir. One of them has been getting restless out here." "Thank you," Sarutobi said before a moment later the door to his office opened and the 2 boys in front of him turned around in their seats to see the new arrivals. As soon as they did, Naruto stiffened in shock. There were 4 of them, obviously a genin team and their jounin sensei. 2 girls, 1 boy, and their female teacher. Each of them had some kind of bladed weapon on them, even if a couple of them seemed strange to the 2 boys. They would seem like an average team if you eliminated the fact that 3 out of 4 of them had red hair and blue eyes. The other member had blonde hair that was surprisingly almost the exact same shade of Naruto's hair and had storm gray eyes. But what really caught Naruto's attention were the headbands. They had a swirl on them that looked like a whirlpool. "No way," Naruto whispered before he whipped around and gave his village leader a look that begged for this not to be a prank. Sarutobi smiled at him and shook his head. Naruto's face instantly relaxed into a look of relief before they heard a voice behind him. "Finally, why did we have to wait outside so long, you old geezer? And who the hell are these 2? Ow!" Naruto turned back around and saw the boy clutching his head while the blonde held a fist over his head, showing that she was the one to discipline her teammate. The other females on the team were chuckling at the boy's misfortune. Rico, show the village leader the proper respect. Ow, Rachel, what the hell? The boy, now identified as Rico, asked the blonde-haired girl. Rachel? That's an odd name. Haku and Naruto thought almost simultaneously. It's your own fault, you know. If you just talk to everyone with the respect they deserve, you wouldn't be constantly having a headache all the time. Rico turned to his red-haired teammate and said, Shut it, Reina. Just because you're older than me by 6 minutes doesn't mean you can criticize me all the time. Reina's cheeks puffed out and she looked like she was just about ready to really rip into her younger brother when the oldest redhead cut in. All right, you two, no more fighting in front of the Hokage. You can continue this once we're back at our hotel. She got a muttered, Yes, Tsunami-sensei, before she turned back to the Hokage and said, My apologies, Lord Hokage. If I may ask, who are these young men? Sarutobi chuckled as he waved the apology away and said, Apology accepted, Tsunami. As for these two splendid shinobi of mine, allow me to introduce to you Naruto Uzumaki, clan heir of the Uzumaki clan for any who reside in this village, and his partner, Haku Momochi. All four Whirlpool Nin's eyes widened before Rico pointed at Naruto and said, No way this guy's our clan heir. I mean, look at him, he doesn't even have our red hair. How can he even be an Uzumaki? Tsunami looked about ready to scold her student again, but never got the chance as Naruto released the full scope of his intent. Naruto's hair began flying all over the place with his clothes flapping around like they were in Category 5 hurricane force winds. Everyone in the room shuddered as they felt like they were in that storm with waves over 75 feet tall surrounding them. And then Naruto took it one step further. After his battle against Kuroda, Naruto realized that he needed to learn how to control the different chakras inside of him. He started with the one that came from his mother, since doing anything with demonic chakra without knowing just what you're doing can be hazardous to your health. As Naruto's hair and clothes flapped around, he showed just what all the hours of working with his clones on the chakra were for. Naruto's special chakra erupted out of his body, forming a bonfire of multicolored light before part of it rose higher than the others and shifted into the form of a fox with 9 tails. Everyone was shaking from the feeling that Naruto was giving off, with only Sarutobi seeming to be unaffected. Then the fox roared at Rico and the boy suddenly found himself on his knees with no recollection of falling. Then, as soon as it came, everything just vanished and Naruto's clothes stopped flapping and his hair fell back into place. Everyone but Sarutobi finally took a much-needed breath. As they did so, Naruto found the Whirlpool Nin's reactions to his little display were quite interesting. Rachel seemed to be stunned by the display of power while Rico seemed to be terrified of him now. Reina was looking at him with awed respect while Tsunami seemed to be somehow proud of him. Naruto was confused by this until Tsunami said with a light tone in her voice, Well now, it's been a while since I've seen someone able to manifest the Uzumaki presence so well. In fact, the last one was Master Umi. Rico, I hope that shows you that he is in fact an Uzumaki, because I don't think that anything else says it louder than that. Rico gave a slow nod as he continued to stare at Naruto with wide eyes. Tsunami then continued with the light tone still in her voice. Now then, Naruto, I'm sure you have some questions about where me and my team have been since, from what little I've gathered with my brief talk with your leader, Whirlpool Village is no longer around and there weren't many survivors. However, let me explain about just what happened first before I answer any questions. Naruto nodded and Tsunami seemed to gather herself as she remembered events decades past. We knew for a while that the Hidden Stone Village would someday make a direct attack against our village. Since we were not arrogant enough to assume that we could repel whatever army they sent our way without massive damage done to our village, we decided to evacuate a large number of our civilians with 50 teams to protect them. But instead of sending them to the Leaf Village where they could have been intercepted, we loaded them onto ships and headed east, where we knew that there was at least one other continent. After 2 months at sea, we reached the next continent. A team of shinobi was supposed to come after us once the war was over. We ended up spending the next several years there, mixing in with the populations there. Said populations are actually much more technologically advanced than us, although none of them knew how to use their chakra before we came. We began taking jobs there while at the same time teaching parts of the populations how to use their chakra. One of these people was Rachel here. Said Blonde gave a small wave as Tsunami continued. After 10 years went by, we had to admit that Whirlpool was almost certainly destroyed and that the Leaf Village had lost the war. But then, 7 years ago, Another Uzumaki came across the sea and found one of our mini villages that we had set up in the coastal town of Bangal. His name was Kiba, and he told us that the Leaf had won the war 2 months after our village destruction and that he had been looking for survivors ever since. He had eventually returned to where Whirlpool Village used to be and found the scroll that contained the orders to send a team out to us. And so, he came for us. Tsunami's eyes closed briefly before she said, "But by that time, many of us didn't want to go back. We were comfortable in a place where they had technology unlike anything we had here. Why should they have to go back?" Still, a number of the older generations wanted to return. Whirlpool was our home, and it was our duty to return to that home, even if it was just to help let old ghosts finally rest in peace. Kiba wanted to stay since he had finally found the rest of his people. Me and my team volunteered to be the ones to head back to this continent and do a reconnaissance of the village to determine if it should be rebuilt as it was or a completely new one should be made, since I have a contract for the Sea Kings that would help make communication faster. Our ship landed at port in the Land of Fire, so we came here first hoping to hire a team to help us. But when we got here, your leader said that there was a child of a survivor that he wanted us to meet. And the rest you know. Naruto stared as the shock of what Tsunami said began to pierce his brain. There were even more survivors of the Whirlpool Village. Survivors numbering hundreds, possibly even 1,000 more than the most hopeful estimate that any village previously had. I'm not the only one who can walk in the sunlight. It was an amazing thought, that there were others who were living comfortable lives and weren't obsessed with revenge like Kuroda had been. He was brought out of his thoughts by Sarutobi, who coughed to gain all of their attention. Once he had it, he said, "Naruto, there is one other thing that Tsunami has forgotten to mention. Since the Chunin exams are so close, she wants to enter her team in it so that they can test themselves against the ninja on this continent. That means that they'll be here for at least another month." Naruto frowned and said, that could be a problem. I'm pretty sure that Haku took the only apartment that was empty that Mr. Adregas owned. And I am not going to let them suffer by staying in a hotel for a whole month. Hey, how come where we stay is decided by this Akunta?" One Riko asked, pointing his finger at Naruto, who looked back over his shoulder with a raised eyebrow. Rachel bashed him on his skull again and said, "Show your clan heir proper respect, Riko Baka." Reina chuckled again at her brother. But before Riko could launch another argument with his sister, Sarutobi coughed, drawing everyone's attention again as he said, "Since Naruto is technically your clan leader while you're in the village, it falls up to him where you stay. On that note, Naruto, you could move into your parents' house. That should give you plenty of room. Or, if you so desire, you could theoretically take over the Senju clan compound since your great-grandaunt was married to the first. There's also the fact that Tsunade has made it quite clear that she doesn't want to return to the village, making it even easier." Naruto cocked his head to the side in thought before he shook his head and said, "I think I'll stick with Mom and Dad's house. Too much trouble with the civilian council if we moved into the Senju compound." Sarutobi nodded and got up, gesturing for Naruto to follow him over to where the picture of his father was. When the old man took the picture down, Naruto saw the seal that he now recognized as a blood recognition seal. He had used them often on scrolls that contained things that not everyone should have access to when he did missions between the village and the capital. Knowing what to do from when Sarutobi had taken a small amount of his blood 7 years ago, Naruto bit into his thumb until it began to bleed. Pressing his now bleeding thumb on the wall, Naruto flashed it down the seal and watched as it glowed before glowing blue lines formed along the wall, blocking in the seal before the section sunk into the wall and dropped down, revealing a small safe. Inside the safe was a small scroll that was labeled Hirashin. The real reason it works. Do not give to Naruto until he is 16 or unlocks his bloodline. Naruto ignored the scroll since he had already read it before and reached behind it where he saw a small key. Naruto took out the key and noticed a stylized whirlpool on the side of the key that he could see. Out of curiosity, he flipped the key over and saw on the other side a symbol that looked like a swirling wind blowing what he assumed to be small leaves around. As Naruto looked down at the key with 100 thoughts running through his head, he was brought out of his thoughts by Sarutobi, who said, "Don't worry about the council, Naruto. With a blood seal on the gate, there's no way they can claim that the house doesn't belong to you. Now, why don't you go check out your new house?" Naruto nodded before he and Haku disappeared. "What the?" Rachel asked with wide eyes before she and Tsunami disappeared as well. "What the hell?" Riko was able to get out one word more than his teammate, who he had unconsciously spoken with at the same time before he and Reina also disappeared. Scene change. Namikaze household. Naruto and Haku reappeared next to a 3-story house that was surrounded by a 7-foot iron wrought fence. The house was roughly 5 miles north by northeast of the Kage Tower and was surrounded by a thin, but thick ring of small trees that ensured privacy. Knowing that both of his parents were far ahead of others when it came to seals, Naruto was willing to bet that each and every one of those trees had some kind of seal that would alert the owner of the house if there was someone in them, if not a seal that would make the intruder very sorry indeed to be in one. Naruto shot a quick look at the house that really seemed normal besides its size before he disappeared and reappeared with Tsunami and Rachel. He disappeared again and reappeared a third time with Riko and Reina. The rest of Rachel's quiet shout had been rudely cut off as she and the others tried to get over the sensation of their surroundings suddenly changing with no warning whatsoever. As the four shook their heads, Haku said, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it eventually." Riko didn't seem to be listening as he took one look around and brought his hand up into the release sign and shouted, "Release!" When nothing happened besides Riko's chakra flaring, Naruto smirked and said, "You finished yet?" Riko scowled at the blonde who paid absolutely no attention to that fact as he walked up to the gate which had the same two symbols as the key did. The wind design was on the left gate while the right held the whirlpool design. The middle of the gate had a lock with a slot where the key was obviously supposed to go and another blood recognition seal surrounding it. Naruto rebit his thumb and swiped the once again bleeding appendage across the seal which glowed blue before disappearing. Naruto then inserted the key and turned it, unlocking the gate. Pushing the now unlocked gate open, Naruto walked in quickly and closed the gate behind the others after they had followed him. Turning back around, Naruto retook his position in front of the group and headed towards the house. Besides the massive training area under the house that had seals to change the environment into anything Naruto or the others wanted, the house was fairly normal. The second and third floors were full of bedrooms with 2 bathrooms on each floor, leading Naruto to believe that this was supposed to be for a growing clan or even for any Uzumaki survivors, while the first floor had 2 bathrooms as well as a large dining room, a good-sized family room, and an impressive kitchen. They'd have to get a new refrigerator though. All of the food inside had been left to rot, leaving one big blob of what looked like toxic sludge that smelled like something had been locked in the fridge and left to die for a good decade. Naruto made a few clones who had the unenviable job of dragging the biohazard out to the backyard where the clones roasted it with a combination wind and fire jutsu. After that was done, Naruto and Haku took off to their apartments to inform Mr. Adragas that they had to move out due to Naruto's new circumstances before they went to buy a new refrigerator. The Whirlpool team meanwhile began to unseal their belongings in their new rooms. Scene change, 1 week until exams. Naruto's training ground 1225. Naruto and Haku were currently back-to-back in the forest of the Hokage monument, with Haku holding one of his senbon needles while Naruto held a kunai in their respective left hands. Scattered around them were kunai and shuriken. All of a sudden, a small figure rushed Naruto with a training bow staff spinning in their hands. When the figure reached him, Naruto deflected the staff with the flat of his kunai blade, and then shoved his other hand out, sending a massively underpowered seal, less great breakthrough into his opponent's torso, sending the figure skidding. He jerked his hand to the side and shot another blast of wind out as another figure tried to get him from his right side with a pair of training tonfa. Both figures slid along the ground before a tree stopped their skids. Naruto shook his head at the first figure and said, "Come on, Konohamaru, if you're going to make Chunin 6 months after you graduate, you're going to have to be able to come up with better strategies than just rushing your opponent when kunai and shuriken don't work. You as well, Undin. Don't be reckless. Use your strengths to help you and your opponent's weaknesses to bring them down." "But boss, what if they don't have a weakness that you can actually use?" Konohamaru asked. Naruto smirked and said, "Hope you never have to actually fight that person, Konohamaru. But if you ever do have to fight a person like that on a mission, then if possible retreat. If not, the world could always use a little more bang for its buck. A well-placed short fuse explosion tag can kill almost anyone if you play your cards right. But even if you don't kill them, you can be sure that the explosion will make things difficult for that person. Just don't try that on an S-ranked Nin or a Kage, because those kind of guys always seem to have a way of avoiding them even if the fuse is 1 second long." The two nodded before all three heard an oof. Looking over his shoulder at Haku showed Moegi holding her stomach from where Haku had lightly punched her. On the ground next to her was her training ninjato. "You should have listened to Naruto more, Moegi. I know that the sword is more direct than a staff or tonfa, but that doesn't mean that you have to rush a person head-on with one. Try to find a flow in your movements and attack without putting everything in one swing." "Yes, Haku-sensei," Moegi said as she grabbed her sword and quickly got back up. The 3 kids looked ready for round 2, but Naruto held up his free hand signaling a stop before he and Haku turned to a tree, and Haku said, How long do you plan on hiding San Nin? The three academy students looked confused before a red-haired boy stepped out from behind the tree and looked at them coldly. Konohamaru and his friends looked stunned that a person had been hiding so close from them, and yet they hadn't seen neither hide nor hair of the guy until Haku called him out. Said ice user just looked at the redhead with his neutral smile on. Naruto had a cocked head look as he studied the fellow nin that he had sensed but hadn't felt deserved a chakra pulse while he helped Konohamaru and his friends train. But now that the boy was actually in his sight, he was beginning to question that thought. The boy had eyes of a killer, and not just those of one who did it because they had to. No, these eyes said that this boy killed so often he no longer even gave the act more than a second's worth of recognition for said act. That kind of person was dangerous. And in Naruto's book, the earlier the age those eyes make an appearance, the more unhinged the person tended to be. None of that showed on Naruto's face though as he cocked his head further to the side and said, "Judging by your age, I'd say either you're here with your team due to a mission and are just looking around, or you're going to be in the Chunin exams a week from today. Either way, that doesn't explain why you seem to have so much interest in me and my partner giving the next generation extra training. Why are you here, San Nin?" The redhead stared into Naruto's eyes for a moment before he said, "You're just like me." Naruto snorted and said, "I highly doubt that. Unlike you, my troubled little friend, I don't have the eyes of a killer unless I'm actually planning to kill my opponent, which I might add is usually only when I'm taking down bandits who threaten nearby towns. You, on the other hand, just scream killer. I can even smell the blood that's in that gourd of yours. So what, pray tell, makes you and I the same?" The other boy just stared at Naruto for a moment, not blinking. The next moment, a truly ungodly amount of killer intent that Naruto never had the displeasure of feeling before fell upon the clearing, causing Konohamaru and his friends to instantly drop on their knees and throw up while Haku began to shake a little at the intent. Naruto was quite sure the reason that his partner wasn't on his knees was because he had experience dealing with other intents from his time with him and Zabuza. Naruto meanwhile kept his eye lock with the kid, unfazed a bit by the intent. He somehow knew that this was a demon's killer intent and now knew just what the kid was talking about. Naruto let the intent wash over him for 10 seconds before he let loose with his Uzumaki chakra, covering the entire field and negating the Ki by sending a modified sense through the chakra using a small amount of his own presence. For everyone else, they went from feeling like there was a viscous monster in front of them that was planning to completely destroy them to a slightly rough ocean with a strong wind blowing. A very big improvement in this case. The redhead meanwhile just kept his stare for a few more moments before he said, "You will prove my existence. Until then, I can wait." He then disappeared in a whirlwind of sand. As the three academy students shakily got to their knees, Haku said, "That boy, he has completely killed his heart, hasn't he?" Naruto nodded and said, "Not a pretty sight, was he?" Turning to Konohamaru and his friends, he said, "Training's over for today, guys. I need to tell the old man that we have a foreign Jinchuriki in the village. Pick up your tools and then take the rest of the day off." The three nodded, knowing how serious this was since Naruto had informed them of his Jinchuriki status and everything it implied when he taught them about all of the different kind of seals that were out there. Naruto and Haku then disappeared, leaving the three to their own devices once they cleaned up the ritual circle they had made with how many kunai and shuriken the three had thrown. Scene change, 1 hour later. An hour later found Naruto, Haku, and the head of the INT department and his second-in-command standing in front of their village leader, with said leader massaging his temples. Sarutobi had been rubbing his forehead for a good half hour as he processed everything Naruto told him and what it could mean for the village. Naruto knew that that had taken the first 10 minutes. The last 20 had been about what to do with that information. On his right, Ibiki and Anko were going through the same process since they would have this kid in their exams. Even though he didn't show it, Naruto had been thinking the same thing. The only difference was that he could actually physically stop Gaara before he tried to start something, while the other two would have to act quickly once Gaara started to do something. Finally, Sarutobi sighed and said, "I hate to say this, but we can't just deny this San Nin entry simply for the fact that he's revealed himself to be a Jinchuriki. That would raise a stink worse than one of my old students' abandoned labs. But I do not like having a foreign Jinchuriki in the exams when Orochimaru is rumored to be the leader of the new village hidden in the Sound. Even if it is the Jinchuriki of an ally, the timing is just too convenient. Ibiki, Anko, I want you two to keep as much of an eye on him as possible. Naruto, from what you have told me, he is quite unstable. Jiraiya will be here for the finals of the exams, but I want you to head to Otafukagai where he should be right now. Once you find him, tell him that I want him to teach you the 5-pronged seal and to be back here as soon as he can. Do you understand?" Naruto nodded and the old leader dismissed them all. The instant he did, Naruto gave a quick salute before he and Haku vanished. Scene change. 5 minutes later, Uzumaki household. Naruto was standing in front of his house with each of his jounin vest pockets filled with sealing scrolls that held everything he would need on a mission. In front of him was Haku and the Whirlpool team listening to him as he laid down some basic rules for while he was gone. Alright, while I'm gone, if you're in the house, you listen to Haku, no questions asked. Tsunami, that includes you. No offense, but I trust Haku more than you right now when it comes to keeping parties out of the house. Tsunami gave a short nod and he continued, next rule. You are for no reason whatsoever allowed to let anyone into the house. Meet them outside if you have to, but I don't care if it's the Hokage himself. No one steps foot into our yard. And finally, if I find out someone is able to duplicate one of those key copies I gave you, then heaven help whoever let it happen, because I will turn your life into hell for it. Understood? Yeah, we get it. No wild parties and don't talk to strangers. We get it already, Rico said and then muttered under his breath about how unfair it was having to do what an Akunta said. This of course prompted Rachel to hit him on the head and the other two team members to sigh. Reina then stepped forward and gave Naruto a hug and said, "Please stay safe, Naruto-sama." Reina quickly stepped back with a blush on her face. Naruto decidedly ignored the blush since Reina had been in some sort of odd stupor whenever she talked to him ever since he had let loose with his presence a few days ago. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as some fangirls he had seen, so he just hoped it would blow over. Giving one more nod to everyone, Naruto gave a quick two-fingered salute as he said, "Try not to burn down the house while I'm gone." Then he disappeared, leaving absolutely no trace that he had been there besides the two shallow footprints in the pathway where he had been standing. Scene change. Otafuku-gai. 30 minutes later. Naruto was currently on the roof of a small casino in the red light zone with his eyes closed and his chakra filled out to its full extent and lightly pulsing every minute. He had been there for roughly 15 minutes and now had a very good idea of what the entire town looked like. He continued pulsing even as he saw a certain figure turn down a nearby street and headed towards the alley that was between the alley and the brothel next to it. 10 seconds later, the person was up on the roof sitting next to him. Naruto let his chakra field drop down to just the building they were over and a small dome around the top of the buildings in the block they were currently in. Keeping his eyes closed in concentration that maintaining a slightly misshaped chakra field required, he said, "The old man said he wants you to teach me the five-pronged seal. He also said he wants you back in the village as soon as possible." Jiraiya looked confused for the first part but sighed at the last. Giving his godson a side glance, he said, "The only reason why the old man would want me in the village as quick as possible when I'd already planned to be back within a month would be that he's worried about village security. But the only reason why you could possibly need that seal was if you had to seal off a Jinchuriki access to their demon's chakra." His eyes narrowed as he asked, "Which village?" "Sand." Jiraiya sighed again and said, "Oh, this is going to be a right pain in the ass. I can tell. Alright kid, let's go. I can't show you that seal just anywhere you know." Naruto nodded and the two disappeared. Scene change. Sarutobi's office. 10:30. Sarutobi and his clone's head snapped up from his paperwork as he felt two presences enter his office without seeming to use either door or window. Seeing the two newcomers, he rose an eyebrow and said, "That was fast. I wasn't expecting either of you to be back until tomorrow at least." Jiraiya shrugged as he said, "Kid got it in only a few hours. And I just had a few more things to discuss with one of my contacts. Now what's this I hear about a foreign Jinchuriki in our village?" Day of the first exam. Uzumaki household. 6 o'clock. A loud yell sounded through the Uzumaki household before a voice could be heard shouting, "Naruto, I'm going to kill you. I don't care if you are our clan heir. You are so dead." In the kitchen, Naruto looked up from the newspaper he had in front of him and chuckled as he thought, "Bucket of water alarm clock successful." He then disappeared as one of Riko's katars stabbed through the air where he had just been sitting. A thoroughly soaked Riko looked around the room before he spotted Naruto leaning up against the counter still reading his newspaper. Riko growled and said, "What's the big idea dropping a bucket of water on my bed?" Naruto shrugged and said, "I figured you would want a wake-up call, so that way you would have plenty of time to get ready for the exam." Riko scowled and said, "So you decided to dump 5 gallons of water on me? Listen you team, when I get my hands on you, you'll be in the hospital for a month." He activated his katar's splitting function, giving him 3 blades in each hand instead of 1. But before his clansmen could attempt to murder him, Naruto saw Rachel enter the room at a brisk pace and promptly bopped Riko on the head as she growled out, "Riko, don't talk to Naruto like that, and keep your voice down. You probably woke up the entire village with your yelling." "Ow! Rachel, don't hit me like that. Besides, he deserves what's coming to him for dumping water on me like that," Riko shouted, earning another hit to the head. "Actually, it was probably a good idea. Otherwise, you might have slept in until lunchtime," Reina said as she entered the kitchen and opened the fridge looking for the milk. Riko scowled at his sister, but before he could make a retort, Tsunami walked in and said, "Just drop it, Riko. There is no point trying to start a pointless argument this early in the morning." Riko's mouth opened and closed as he tried to form an argument against the treatment he was being shown this morning, but a pointed glare from his half-awake sensei stopped him in his tracks. Naruto smirked at Riko's misfortune before he said, "As entertaining as this is, we really need to get going. You ready, Haku?" Haku, who had seen the entire event play out from his own seat at the table where he had been finishing off a bagel, nodded as he stood and said, "I'm ready, Naruto." Naruto nodded and said, "Then let's go. Remember guys, be at the academy no later than 9. And with those final words of parting, he promptly disappeared while Haku formed a mirror of ice and followed his partner. Scene change. Academy. Naruto reappeared in front of the academy. 10 seconds later, a mirror of ice appeared and Haku walked out of it before its molecules separated and the mirror turned into vapor that quickly diffused in the morning air. Grinning at Haku, Naruto said, "Have fun." Getting a grin in return, Naruto watched as his partner walked into the academy before he disappeared again as he headed to the Hokage Tower where a number of Jounin were planning on watching the first exam through a crystal ball that was 20 times bigger than the Hokage's personal one. Haku, meanwhile, was making his way to the 3rd floor. While he was on the 2nd, he saw Kotetsu and Izumo cover one of the class signs in a genjutsu and then henge into younger versions of themselves. Reaching the 3rd floor, Haku walked into room 301 and joined the group of Jounin who were waiting for Ibiki. Haku joined in the small talk for a few minutes before Ibiki came through the doorway of the connected classroom and said, "All right people, let's go over one more time just what is and isn't acceptable for the maggots to do." 3 hours later, Haku, who had a thin, faceted ice mirror in one of the corners of the room, saw Naruto's relatives and their teammate enter the room. The 3 Whirlpool Nins took a quick but thorough stock of their surroundings, showing that they knew that this was indeed a competition where they were the minority and most likely first to be targeted for that fact. After their quick scan, the 3 walked along the wall until they were in the corner on the other side of the wall that the mirror was attached to. Haku noticed that the 3 stone teams seemed to pay them the most attention and made a note to be ready to step in if anything got too far out of hand. 5 minutes after that, the Leafs' 3 rookie teams filed in one after the other with only 20 seconds between them tops. Haku smirked at Sasuke's misfortune of his 2 biggest fangirls having a tug of war with him. But then a white-haired Leaf genin approached them and showed them a deck of cards, causing Haku's eyes to narrow. No ninja worth his genin rank would give out information to potential enemies. That boy was hiding something and Haku didn't like the fact that he didn't know what it was. "I see you've noticed it as well," Ibiki said from Haku's side where he was watching the genin as well. Haku nodded and said, "That one is planning something. Whether it is to use the rookies as meat shields, or to get a read on their mannerisms so he knows what to expect from them, I'm not sure. And it could be something else completely." Ibiki grunted and the 2 continued to watch the glasses wearing Nin continued to string the rookies along. But then the 2 saw the team from Sound begin to move through the crowd towards him. Ibiki's eyes narrowed as he and Haku watched the Nin avoid a punch from one of the Sound Nins only to fall to his knees and release the contents of his stomach. "I think they've waited long enough," Ibiki growled. "Yes, sir," Haku said before he donned his mask that had had the mist mark smoothed over and then repainted. Then the 2 of them and a small number of the Jounin who were with them vanished in Shunshin's. Reappearing in the room with all the genin, Ibiki shouted out, "That's enough. There is to be no fighting unless we say so. Anyone who does so without our permission will be thrown out of the exams. Am I clear?" The man got nods from all of the genin, most of which seemed terrified of the human bear that was glaring at them. Ibiki shot a particularly nasty glare at the Sound team before he held up a card with the number 1 on it and said, "Good. Now that we understand each other, pick up one of these numbers, get into the next room and sit down in your seat so I can explain the next test." There was a large scrabble as the genin quickly transferred themselves from the waiting room to the testing room. None of them seemed to want to make the bear in front of them angry at them. Once everyone was seated, Ibiki strode to the front of the room with Haku by his side. Turning to face them, he began laying down the rules. "All right, maggots, listen up, because I'm only going to say the rules once. And no questions either. Now in front of you you'll find a piece of paper. Do not flip it over until I explain all of the rules. Rule number 1. Each of you starts out here with 10 points. The test has 10 questions, each worth 1 point. For each question you get wrong, we subtract a point from you. Get all 10 right and you retain the 10 points you have. But if, for example, you answer 3 questions incorrectly, we take your 10 points. Subtract 1 point for every wrong answer, and your total drops down to 7. Rule number 2. This written test is still a team event. Passing or failing will be determined by the sum of the points held by 3 members of each cell. The object is for each team to have as few deductions as possible from its joint 30-point total. Rule number 3. If, during the course of the exam, a candidate does anything out of the ordinary, in other words, anything that leads the proctors to determine that he or she has cheated, we subtract 2 points from each member of the cheater's team. "We'll be watching you," one of the jounin in the middle of the vertical row along the windows said while tapping his clipboard. "As will I," Haku said before mirrors formed in the room with 1 in each corner and 2 on the ceiling. The genin's stunned murmuring turned to stunned silence when another mirror formed behind Haku, and he stepped back and seemed to merge into the mirror, causing his image to appear in all of them. Ibiki gave a dark chuckle and said, "Last rule. If any individual loses all 10 of his or her points, that person's entire cell, regardless of how the other 2 members do, will be disqualified." "But that's unfair," Sakura shouted with other genin muttering their agreement. "Silence," Ibiki shouted, making them all shut up before he said, "Those are the rules. If you don't like them, then you and your team can leave now. Now then, you have 1 hour, get started." There was the sound of papers flipping before Ibiki, and all of the other proctors grinned at the gurgled sounds some of the genin made. Grinning to himself, the scarred one thought, "Let the fun begin." The next 45 minutes proved interesting for Haku and the other proctors as various genin found ingenious ways to cheat without being caught. Unfortunately, they had to let the last Uchiha and the few Hyugas in attendance to get by using their dojutsu, even if only Hinata tried to hide the fact that she was using it with a minor genjutsu. Others were much more intriguing in figuring out how they were getting their answers. The Whirlpool Nin had each sent chakra through the tables they were sitting at and pushed a thin amount into the other test papers to get their answers. The sound Nin seemed to be actually listening to everyone writing for the answers, while the rock Nin appeared to be using the vibrations from all of the people moving pencils across paper to know what to write down. And while most of the other genin didn't do anything that was really that fancy, some of them came up with some rather unusual methods. Finally, 45 minutes later, and nearly half the teams caught with their figurative hands in the cookie jar, Ibiki called time as he said, "All right, maggots, pencils down, it's time for the final question." As soon as he had everyone's attention, he continued. "Before we begin, there's a few extra rules you need to be aware of. First off, you must choose whether or not to take the 10th question." "What? Why would anyone choose to not take the 10th question?" a sand kunoichi with her hair in 4 ponytails asked. Ibiki gained a dark grin as he said, "Because of the next rule. If you refuse to take the question, you automatically get a 0 on your test regardless of how many points you have and you and your team fails." "What? Then of course we'll take it. What kind of idiot wouldn't?" Hiba shouted. Ibiki grinned and said, "Someone who also knows the last rule. If you do choose to take it and get it wrong, then your team score is brought to 0 and you'll never be able to take the exams again. Furthermore, you will be kept at the rank of genin forever even if you fight in 10 shinobi wars." Haku mentally chuckled at all of the genin freaking out and thought, "And now we see who really has the strength to go the farthest." But even as he thought this, teams started dropping out like flies. Sometimes it was just one of the team members deciding that he or she couldn't handle the stress. Other times it was the whole team. One thing Haku noticed though was that the Whirlpool and Rock Nins didn't seem to be the least bit worried. Haku frowned at that, wondering if those 4 teams knew something the others didn't. But before she could ponder it for too long, Ibiki took one last glance around the room and said, "It's time for the final question. If any more of you are going to play it safe, then now is the time to leave." There were a few worried looks, but no one else left. Nodding to himself, Ibiki said, "Well then, I guess we'll just get to it then. For those of you who stayed for the 10th question, congratulations, you all passed. Haku swore he heard crickets outside during the 10 seconds of pure silence in the room as the genin's brains tried to match what they just heard with something they could understand. Sadly, the quiet is always before the storm. What? That one word was the only one that the proctors understood as the genin began shooting questions left, right, and center after the collective shout. Ibiki grew a tick mark before he did a few hand signs that the rookie Leaf Nin instantly recognized. They were just in time to cover their ears before Ibiki's head grew to truly massive proportions, and he shouted out, "Well, you maggots, shut up!" Ibiki's head returned to normal proportions and he glared at all of the now silent genin before he said, "Now then, allow me to explain just what this was all about." Scene change, 1 hour later. Gate 1 access to Forest of Death. Anko gave another count of the teams in front of her and thought, 24 teams. They've either got balls of gold or Ibiki is getting soft on me. Nah, not possible. If Ibiki was getting soft, he'd have retired by now. Gaining a grin that scared the genin even more than Ibiki's did, Anko said, "All right, maggots. Welcome to my little home away from home. This here is Training Area 44, although me and the rest of us actual shinobi like to call it the Forest of Death. Don't worry though, one little run through here and you'll be calling it that as well." As if to add credence to that statement, a massive roar filled the air, causing the trees of the forest to lightly sway as if the massive behemoths of the forest were caught in a rough wind. Anko turned slightly to look over her shoulder with a grin and said, "Sounds like the tiger population is doing well." All of the genin stared at her as they wondered if she was serious, and even more terrifying, how big a tiger must need to be able to roar like that. Anko snapped them out of it as she said, "All right, here's how this exam is going to work. This will be a no-holds-barred capture the flag battle that will take place for 5 days, or 120 hours. Your flags are these 2 scrolls." Here Anko reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 scrolls as she continued. Each team will be given either a heaven or an earth scroll. Your objective is to collect the other scroll and make it to the tower in the center of this forest before 5 days is up. Each team will get 1 scroll for 3 of these waivers. She put the scrolls back and took out some waivers from a pocket that was sewed to the inside of her coat. The Leaf Village isn't responsible if you die in there or not, hence the waivers. You have 30 minutes for you and your teammates to sign that form and to get a scroll from that booth by the fence. Think carefully before you sign, because you are putting more than your ninja career on the line if you decide to go into that forest. Any questions? Yeah, what about food? Chuji shouted. Anko smirked and said, "There's plenty of nature's bounty in the forest. Just be careful what you eat, 'cause there's also plenty of nature's wrath in there as well." Chuji slumped over as Anko said, "Now if there's no more questions, start signing." 30 minutes later, all of the teams had signed their forms and were heading to their gates. A waterfall team stayed behind near Gate 1, but otherwise it was just Anko and the 3 chunin who had been sitting in the booth. Deciding to indulge herself in one of her vices while she waited to send the poor genin into her favorite place in the village, the snake summoner made a mud clone and gave it some money before sending it to get her some dango. The clone got back 10 minutes later, just in time for Anko to begin the exam. Taking the bag of dango and cup of red bean soup from the clone, she dispelled it and set her treat on the booth's counter, sending a small glare at the chunin there, warning them not to touch. She then grabbed the handheld microphone that was hanging from one of the walls and clicked it on. From speakers positioned on all 44 gates, Anko's voice gained all of the team's attention as she said, "All right, maggots. The second exam begins now." 44 gates all opened at once, and the teams rushed into the forest as the chunin closed the gates after them and proceeded to lock them with chains that were held together with 3 padlocks. 30 minutes later, Anko was laying on the top of the shack putting the finishing touches of the hidden leaf symbol she was making in a nearby tree with her dango sticks when a chunin suddenly appeared in a shunshin. Turning her head to look at him, she saw the serious look he had and said, "What is it?" The chunin gave a brief salute before he said, "I need you to come with me, ma'am. Bodies of a team that is taking this exam were just found outside of the training area." Anko frowned before she leapt off the roof and landed next to him and said, "Lead the way." The chunin led her to a small ring of Buddhas that was a 10-minute walk from the training area. Inside the ring were 2 more chunin looking down at 3 bodies. As Anko walked into the ring, she saw blood on some of the Buddhas, with one's front almost completely covered in the stuff. Shaking her head, she said, "That is no way to treat a Buddha." "I said the exact same thing," one of the chunin said before motioning to the 3 bodies and said, We called you as soon as we learned that they were supposed to be in the exams. Also, there's something wrong with their faces. It's like they never existed. Anko's eyes narrowed as she gently moved one of the bodies so that she could see what the man was talking about. When she saw the face, or rather the lack of one, her eyes widened before they narrowed instantly. Turning to one of the Chunin, she said, "You have their IDs, right?" The Chunin nodded and handed her the 3 ninja passports that contained all of their information. Flipping it open, Anko let out a curse before she slapped it shut and said, "Shit, they're already in the forest. You go get the Hokage and tell him his old students in the forest. Let him also know that I've gone ahead. You go find Uzumaki and tell him that I need him to head to the forest and search every inch of it for a person with the same chakra as my curse seal. And I want you to go to the NCIS team and have them check this crime scene for anything we missed." NCIS, Ninja Criminal Investigation Squad, is an idea of Namikaze. Each Chunin saluted before they rushed off to carry out their orders. Once she was relatively alone, Anko frowned at the bodies and thought, "What are you planning, you bastard?" Shaking her head, she then turned back to the forest and rushed towards a confrontation with a demon of her past. Scene change, Uzumaki compound. Naruto was currently taking advantage of the peace and quiet that was so rare in his household nowadays by checking all of the seals that resided in the perimeter of his house. As he checked one particularly nasty seal in a tree that was at 7 o'clock in relation to the front door, he said, "What is it?" The nearby Chunin, who wisely was staying out of the ring of trees, gave a quick salute and said, "There have been intruders in the second exam. Anko said she wanted you to search the forest and look for someone who had the same chakra as the one in her curse seal." Naruto's head snapped around so fast the Chunin actually heard it crack a little. Naruto looked at the Chunin with dead serious eyes as he said, "Is that really what she said? Word for word?" The Chunin nodded, barely getting his head down an inch before Naruto was gone. Scene change, Forest of Death. Anko stared at her old traitor of a master from where she was standing in a tree across from him as she tried to stall the sick man. "So what are you doing here? Surely something as lowly as participating in a Chunin exam is beneath you," she said. True, but it's not the exam that interests me, but the participants. One in particular is very interesting. Young Sasuke will allow me to go far with my plans," Orochimaru said. Anko frowned, but before she could say anything to that remark, Orochimaru's eyes widened before a kunai was suddenly in his chest with a blonde Jinchuriki holding the kunai's handle in a reverse grip. Orochimaru continued to stare in shock for a few more seconds before he suddenly grinned and melted into a big clump of mud. Naruto disappeared and reappeared next to Anko with a frown on his face as he said, "Damn. I thought for sure I had gotten the real one. My what speed. If I hadn't reacted instantly to my instincts and switched with a mud clone, then that could have been very painful," Orochimaru said as he came out of the trunk of the tree his clone had been standing on. Naruto frowned at him as he put his kunai away before his hands became coated in chakra as he formed half-ram signs and held his arms loosely by his sides. Orochimaru rose an amused eyebrow as he said, "Oh? Do you really think that you stand a chance against a Sannin when you no longer have the element of surprise?" Naruto cocked his own eyebrow before he disappeared. Orochimaru gained a confused look as he and Anko felt so much chakra surround them it was actually slightly visible. There are 4 degrees of burns. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Let's go with 4th degree. Orochimaru and Anko looked around at the sound of Naruto's voice that seemed to come from all around before a massive 4th degree burn, as wide as Naruto's hand, suddenly appeared across the white snake's chest. Before Orochimaru could even register the pain, another burn just as wide crossed the first burn, making a large X. Then both of his arms were left with thin burns going down their sides. Only then did the enemy begin to feel the extreme amounts of pain. As Orochimaru gritted his teeth to force himself not to scream, another burn appeared running straight down his back, with another running across before the first was even done forming. Then he was reacquainted with a different kind of pain as the blonde reappeared in front of him with his foot already in the side of his opponent's face. As Orochimaru went flying towards the end of the branch, Naruto's hands disappeared before they reappeared a second later in the bird sign, while Naruto drew in a massive breath before exhaling with a shout of, "Wind style! Wind Sanban!" Hundreds of invisible Sanban needles made of wind shot out of the blonde's mouth at impossible speeds and tore through Orochimaru's body. However, when the body landed at the very end of the branch, It lost all similarities to a human body as it caved in on itself and was revealed to be a mud clone. Naruto's eyes narrowed at the mass of mud as he softly cursed under his breath. Damn it! When did he make the switch? I didn't even detect it. Where is that bastard? Naruto's chakra mist suddenly turned into a chakra fog as the blonde tried to locate his target. Anko meanwhile was just staring at her comrade in disbelief as she thought, he actually forced him to retreat? I know he's an elite jounin for a reason, but still. Meanwhile, Orochimaru was currently making his way out of Dodge Underground. He finally felt that he was far enough away when he came to the last ring of trees before the fence. Pulling himself out of the ground, the snake winced at the burns across his upper body and arms hitting open air. Looking back into the forest, he frowned and thought, that boy is dangerous. I will need to make plans so that he doesn't interfere with my goals. He then turned back to the fence before seeming to melt back into the ground as he left the area to nurse his wounds. For some, 5 days in the forest felt like the longest torture imaginable. For others it passed by in a blur. Naruto was one of the ones who seemed to have plenty of time to analyze everything he could have done differently when he encountered Orochimaru. Yeah, he had the upper hand the entire time, but did he actually do anything meaningful? The only thing he had killed in that forest were a couple of mud clones. The actual snake itself had gotten away and was doing who knows what right now. Naruto shook his head from those thoughts as he looked up from his position where he was standing upside down on the ceiling of the battle room in the Tower of Death. Below him were 10 teams standing in rows of 3 looking forward at the Hokage where he was speaking in front of Ibiki, Anko, a bunch of Chunin, and all of the team's jounin instructors. Well, all but the sounds. They were pretty sure that Orochimaru had planned to try and slip in as their jounin, but with the 4th degree burns Naruto gave him 5 days ago, that clearly wasn't possible. No genjutsu can cover up that much pain, even if it was the numbing kind that 4th degrees brought about after the first hour. Shaking his head from those thoughts, he instead looked back at the teams and thought, almost exactly half the teams passed. What are the odds of that happening? Turning his head to look at Anko, he had to smirk at her face and thought, look at her. She's pissed. She probably thought Ibiki had been getting soft for letting so many teams through and is now probably wondering what the hell's wrong with her beloved forest. Said 10 teams were the team his distant relatives and their teammate formed, one of the 3 teams the Hidden Rock Village sent, a team from the village hidden in the rain, the team from Sound, a team from their ally the Sand, and from the Leaf Village, the 3 rookie teams as well as Team 9 from last year and an older team that consisted of a white-haired teen and his 2 teammates who wore veils to cover their faces and shades to cover their eyes. He heard his brother Jinchuriki say something about enough with the talking and get on with the life and death stuff. Rolling his eyes, Naruto disappeared and reappeared leaning against him with his arm across his shoulders, surprising everybody as he said, impatient this one is he not Lord Hokage? The redhead's eyes widened even as Sand rushed at Naruto. But the blonde was gone the instant the last word was out of his mouth and was now standing beside said leader who was currently chuckling. Almost all of the genin in front of them had wide eyes besides the Whirlpool Nin and the rookies in Teams 7 and 8. As he enjoyed all of their stunned expressions, Naruto took a second to look at the mark on Sasuke's neck. It seemed to be throbbing in pain every once in a while and Naruto frowned a little knowing that it would have to be sealed soon. That small frown turned into a big one as Ino decided to open her big mouth and shouted, Naruto, you idiot! What the hell are you doing here? From her spot behind Ino, Rachel began frowning at the blonde while Naruto lazily shifted his focus over to her and said, Lord Hokage asked me to be the proctor for the final exam. Now kindly be quiet so I can explain what the 3rd exam will be. Ino bristled and looked about ready to get into a one-sided shouting match with her former classmate, but a stern look from her sensei stopped her cold. Nodding to them all, Naruto said, for those of you who do not know me, allow me to introduce myself. I am Naruto Uzumaki and as I've just said, I'll be your 3rd exam proctor. Now then, the 3rd exam will consist of a group of 1-on-1 matches that will be held within a month's time in the Chunin's arena in the village. Why the month wait, you ask? It's so the delegates who are coming to watch you compete have time to get here. Now normally, this is where we would offer any of you to drop out and then draw lots to see who goes against who. But with so many teams passing the 2nd exam, we need to have preliminary rounds since no one wants to spend all day watching a tournament where 36 brats are having slap fights with each other. Most of said 36 brats glared at Naruto who didn't care while the adults in the room all chuckled. Keeping his straight face, Naruto said, now, as I said, the fights in a month will be 1-on-1s and these preliminary rounds will be as well. That said, If any of you are here simply because your teammates wanted to become Chunin, then feel free to walk right out that door, because from here on out, it's all or nothing. No one is forfeiting. So can you stop with the useless talking and get on with it already? Gaara asked with an annoyed voice as a small amount of killing intent began to fill the air, making everyone nervous as they glanced at him. Naruto's head rolled to the side a little as he sent a lazy look at the Jinchuriki before he seemed to flicker for the briefest of instants, and the preteen's eyes widened as he folded over holding his stomach. As everyone stared in shock, Naruto said, "Anyone else want to be a smartass about this? No? Good. Now, are there anyone who wants to forfeit?" When no one raised their hands to forfeit, Naruto smiled at them and said, "Good. Now the rules for the preliminaries are as follows. You lose if you forfeit, obviously, if you lose consciousness, if I believe you cannot continue, or if you just plain die. If I tell you to stop fighting, then you will do so or else. And believe me, you wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Now, the matches will be chosen randomly by the computer screen behind me." As Naruto had been talking, said computer screen's cover had slid down, revealing itself. "When your name is displayed, come down for your fight. Otherwise, you are to remain on the balconies on either wall and stay out of the way of the fight currently going on. If I catch any of you interfering in anyone else's fight, I will disqualify your entire team." Naruto glared at them as he said the last sentence, and everyone gulped before he suddenly did a 180 as he said, "Right then, enough talking. Let's see who's fighting first." The board lit up and began going through names for a few minutes before it stopped on the first two of a long series of matches. Naruto shot a quick look over his shoulder before he looked back at the genin and said, "Sasuke Uchiha, Daisuke Dangai, you two are up first. Everyone else get off the floor." All of the genin besides Sasuke and one of the rock genin, a heavy-built guy who looked like he was part of a cliff face, turned and headed to the balcony. As their sensei passed them, Naruto saw Kakashi pause and whisper something to Sasuke. He didn't bother with it since he'd already been given his orders when it came to the Uchiha. Once the three were alone on the floor, Naruto asked, "Do either of you have any problems being the first ones?" Seeing the two shake their heads, Naruto said, "Very well then. First round of the preliminaries. Sasuke Uchiha versus Daisuke Dangai begin." Naruto gave a quick but long jump away, landing 5 feet away, leaving Sasuke to study his massive opponent. Daisuke, a black-haired boy with gray eyes, studied him as well before he shifted into a heavy-set taijutsu stance and gave a non-committal grunt as he said, "So I get to face the so-called last Uchiha? Should be interesting." "HN," Sasuke grunted. Daisuke frowned and said, "Not much of a conversationalist, are you?" "HN." Naruto and everyone else sweat dropped at Sasuke's response before Daisuke was suddenly in Sasuke's face with said face full of a fist. As Daisuke's right hook connected with Sasuke's face, the Uchiha was sent flying and landed skidding halfway to the wall. Sakura and Ino's shouts of "Sasuke-kun" permeated the air while everyone else was giving off soft whistles at the big guy's speed. Naruto meanwhile had a raised eyebrow at just how fast Sasuke had managed to recover from his skidding position. The one of the duck hair had barely hit the ground before he was moving his body from out of control skid into a crouch and thrusting his hand into his weapons pouch. 2 seconds later, Sasuke's hand was launching a brace of shuriken at his opponent before his right foot hit the wall, stopping his backward progress, and he rushed at his opponent. Daisuke brought his own hand to his pouch and grabbed a kunai to deflect the shuriken before he blocked Sasuke's incoming kick with his other hand, which he closed around Sasuke's leg and used to toss the Uchiha over his shoulder. Daisuke then followed up with a punch to Sasuke's stomach that sent him into the arena floor, coughing up a little blood from the force of the blow. As Sasuke tried to get his breath back, Daisuke took a step back and looked down at his opponent with his head cocked to the side curiously and said, "You know, I would have expected a Uchiha to be doing better right now." "Shut up," Sasuke growled as he got to his feet. "Seriously though, the Sharingan hasn't even made an appearance yet, so I have to wonder, do you just not care? Or are you really that weak?" Daisuke asked in that same curious tone of voice that continued to piss Sasuke off. "I said shut up," Sasuke roared as he activated his Sharingan and blurred as he rushed to Daisuke and kicked upwards in a move that anyone who spent any time fighting with a user of the Iron Fist would recognize instantly, as he kicked his opponent in the chin, sending him flying in the air and kicked up off the floor after him. Sasuke positioned himself under Daisuke and placed his finger against his back, temporarily paralyzing his opponent. Daisuke somehow was able to turn his head to look back at Sasuke and said, "Dancing leaf shadow, huh?" Sasuke swore he was smirking at him right now like he knew it was copied. "That's right. From here it's all original though," Sasuke said. before he suddenly flinched as black marks began to make their way out of the curse mark out of their seal. Meanwhile on the arena floor, Naruto saw the seal activate and thought, "Shit, the seal's activating." But before he could go through with his orders, he saw the black marks recede. Sighing with relief, he thought, "I guess Sasuke is made of stronger stuff than I thought." Giving a quick look around faster than most human eyes could follow, he thought, "But does this mean that Team of a Snake is nearby?" Back in the air, Sasuke had just finished pushing the curse mark back into its sealed form. Taking a breath, he said, "Sorry about that. Now then, as I was saying, Lion's Barrage." Sasuke launched a kick that Daisuke was able to block, but Sasuke used the block to pivot around his bigger opponent and began to really lay into his opponent's other side, especially his right arm, to keep him from blocking anything else until they landed on the ground and he tumbled away until Kakashi stopped his progress with his foot. Naruto meanwhile was looking at Daisuke, who was slowly getting up from the floor while clutching his right arm that the blonde could see was broken in at least 3 places. Feeling the blonde's gaze, Daisuke glanced up at Naruto and shook his head to the unasked question. Naruto nodded and said, "Daisuke is unable to battle anymore. Therefore, the winner of the first match is Sasuke Uchiha." How anticlimactic. As a medic rushed over to look at Daisuke's arm, Ino and Sakura began yelling about how cool Sasuke was and how they knew he would win. They shut rather quickly though when Naruto and the other kunoichi genin in the room shot them a glare. Said Uchiha was meanwhile being led away by Kakashi out the double doors. Naruto studiously ignored that though as he looked back up at the board and sent a small pulse of chakra to a seal in his pocket to signal the board to start its second sequence. The board stopped its shuffling and Naruto rose an eyebrow as he and all of the other hidden leaf jounin each thought, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." The old man meanwhile was looking at the board like it had just placed 2 mountains of paperwork on his desk back at the Hokage Tower. Sighing, Naruto turned his head back forward and said, "Will Shino Aburame and Suzumabachi Kamizuri please come down?" As his former classmate and his opponent walked down the 2 balconies, Naruto took a moment to study the kunoichi from the hidden rock village. She had the brown hair that was typical of the population of their continent and gray eyes. She wore a battle kimono that stopped at her knees and was cut to leave her shoulders bare. Her eyes were currently narrowed in a glare at her opponent as they walked down the stairs. Shino meanwhile walked down the stairs with his head bent in thought. Any clues to what he was thinking were hidden by the shades he wore, although Naruto and the other jounin in the room could hear his coat buzzing as the destruction beetles that were inside the Aburame's body prepared themselves for battle. Once the 2 were in front of him, Naruto said, "Round 2, Shino Aburame versus Suzumabachi Kamizuri. Begin." Chopping his hand down as he jumped away, Naruto was barely 2 feet away before Suzumabachi tossed out her arm and 3 shuriken flew towards Shino with 5 bees right on their tail. Shino retaliated by lifting his arms and sent a small group of bugs out in front of him, which formed a wall stopping the shuriken before 10 of the beetles broke off from the wall and rushed the bees, tearing into them in pincer movements before continuing on towards his opponent. Suzum in turn made 4 hand signs in quick selection, calling a large swarm of bees with what looked like miniature paper bombs into existence. The swarm rushed towards the wall of insects in front of it, slicing through the 10 insects in front of it before they all slammed into the wall and exploded with enough force to slightly shake the room they were in. Suzum smirked as the smoke cleared and revealed Shino's body on the floor, badly burnt and bleeding. Her smirk quickly disappeared though as she felt a 2 kunai pressing up against her throat, and a voice from the wall behind her said, "Do you yield?" Suzum turned her head to see a 3rd Shino step out of the shadows cast by the foreign side's balcony. "How?" Suzum asked, and the 3rd Shino pointed back to where the body was. When she looked back forward, the blood was gone and the body burst into insects. Insect clone and genjutsu combination. "I was never actually in front of you," Shino said. Suzum let out a curse before she sighed and said, "Fine, I yield." "Winner, Shino Aburame." Naruto called before pushing chakra into the board's seal again as the 2 insect clones holding their opponent hostage broke apart and went back inside Shino's coat as he walked away. The screen beeped and Naruto looked back before calling out, "Ino Yamanaka, Rachel Aliston, you 2 are up." Ino began walking towards the stairs, while Rachel decided on the more direct approach and hopped over the railing, softening her landing with chakra. As she walked calmly towards Naruto, he gave her a slight nod which was returned before he turned his attention to Ino as she made her way down. Once Ino had finally joined them and the 2 girls were standing across from each other, Naruto rose his hand and slashed it down as he called out, "3rd round, start." Naruto jumped away from the two. But even though the fight had started, Rachel was just staring at Ino with an intensity that made Ino, who found she couldn't look away, nervous. After a minute of having an unwilling staring contest, Ino finally couldn't take it and shouted, "What are you staring at?" Rachel cocked her head an inch to the right as she said, "Tell me something, please. Is it true you were once a classmate of Naruto-sama?" Ino's brows furrowed as she said, "Naruto-sama? Why the hell would you call that loser something like that?" "I see. So you were. And it seems you've already answered the other question I had," Rachel said with a small frown on her face. Ino started to ask before she got a fist in her chest and was sent flying by Rachel, who had pumped chakra into her legs to close the 4-foot gap between them so fast it looked like a blur to most of the genin present. "I would have thought that a clan heir such as yourself would have known not to insult another clan heir like you so obviously have a habit of doing." As she was speaking, Rachel reached over her shoulders and removed the 2 hook swords from her back. Ino gulped at the sight of the swords, which had hooks at the end and the cloth-wrapped steel handles set in a bladed dented rectangle. At the other end of the handle was a short spike of steel. Think Shaolin monk hook sword used deadliest warrior. Rachel's storm-gray eyes turned cold as she said, "One should always show the proper respect to those around them. And in my eyes, Naruto-sama has earned that respect. He has given me and my team food and lodgings in his household for our stay here when he could have just simply left us in a hotel. And yet you seem to have no respect for him whatsoever. Even if he's not a member of your clan, he is still your superior officer. Anyone who doesn't respect their superiors does not deserve the rank of Chunin. I'll be glad to disqualify you." Ino had finally gotten up during Rachel's speech and glared at Rachel as she drew 2 kunai and said, "Well, I'll be glad to beat down anyone who worships that dead last like you obviously do." The Yamanaka charged at Rachel, swiping at her with 2 kunai, only for Rachel to swiftly swipe both blades away with her own as she sidestepped and sent a roundhouse kick to her opponent's head, sending her flying again. "You know, if there's one thing I hate more than someone who doesn't show proper respect to those who are in charge of looking after you and showing you the ropes, I would have to say it's those who don't take this kind of thing seriously. I'm sure you know the types, those who think this is just a game or are expecting some knight in shining armor to appear when they screw up. After all, where I come from, if you enter this business, then you need to be willing to go all the way." As Rachel spoke, she placed her swords back onto her back, seeing no point in staining them with a fangirl's blood, before she blazed through hand signs and shouted, "Water style, water bullet jutsu." As the 3 bullets of water shot out of Rachel's mouth, Ino kicked the ground from her laying down position and back flipped away in time to avoid them. It was a good thing she did, since the projectiles left craters 2 inches wide where they hit the floor. But before Ino could sigh in relief, she heard Rachel's voice whispering behind her. "Pathetic. Lightning style. Knockout palm jutsu." Ino's body twitched once as Rachel's lightning-covered palm hit her spine before her eyes rolled up to the back of her skull and she fell over. Rachel took a step back as Naruto appeared next to Ino's body and performed a quick diagnostic jutsu to make sure Ino's body was still functioning before he stood up and said, "Winner, Rachel Aliston." Rachel gave a quick bow of respect to Naruto before she headed to the bleachers while the medics approached to revive her opponent. "She doesn't seem to mess around," Sarutobi thought as Naruto used the seal again and the board began its job. When it finished cycling through names, Naruto called out, "Hinata Hyuga. Sai. You're next." Hinata took a deep breath as she turned and began walking towards the stairs. Sai meanwhile kept a blank face as he walked beside her. "HM. A root member that specializes in ink ninjutsu versus a member of the Hyuga clan. Sai is going to have trouble on this one, that's for sure. It should still be a good fight though," Kakashi thought to himself as his student turned to face his opponent in front of Naruto. "Now everyone here will see how pathetic you are and that it is your fate to remain a failure," Niji thought with grim satisfaction. Naruto looked between the two as he thought time to see what Hinata's been up to. "I just hope this fight isn't as short as the last few." Shaking his head from those thoughts, he gave both one last look as he said, "Are you two ready?" Sai gave a small nod, maintaining his blank look while Hinata gave him a small smile with hers. Naruto nodded before he rose his hand and said, "Very well then, begin." He quickly slashed his hand down and jumped back. The instant the last letter was out of Naruto's mouth, Sai copied his actions and jumped back while pulling out a brush and scroll. As soon as his feet touched ground, Sai had a painted wolf on his scroll. Making a hand sign, Sai calmly said, "Ninja art, beast art mimicry." The wolf shot off the paper and rushed at high speed towards Hinata, who had also jumped back while activating her Byakugan. However, as soon as it got in arm's reach of her, she blasted it apart with a palm strike filled with chakra. The wolf exploded in a splatter of ink that Hinata avoided by jumping back as she didn't want to get any of the possibly reusable ink on her. Sai meanwhile cocked his head and gave a small false smile as he said, It seems that I was right. My drawings are ineffective against you. But what if there is more than one? As he was speaking, Sai had been constantly drawing on his scroll. As soon as he finished speaking, he made his hand sign again and 10 tigers rushed off the paper and moved with incredible speed to surround the Hyuga heiress. Hinata shoved the small jolt of anxiousness that entered her body from being surrounded out the door before it had a chance to get a foothold in her body. Once she was surrounded and the tigers prepared to pounce, she spun with her arms held out, sending a pulse of chakra out that slashed through the ink constructs as she called out, "Chakra wave!" Up in the stands, Niji looked on in shock as he thought, what was that? It almost looked like an incomplete rotation. But a rotation isn't supposed to continue expanding like that. Meanwhile, Sai was having slightly different thoughts. Well, that's unusual. I did not know the Hyuga had a jutsu that had a larger range than the rotation. I will have to be on guard for that. But still, since none of my creations can get to her, I'll have to go in myself. My sword should help keep her at bay. Sai put thought to action as he drew his tanto. When Hinata saw the short blade that was flat on the end, she tensed before sliding into a slightly different gentle fist stance. Sai took notice of the new stance and slipped into one of his own before he ran towards Hinata and sent a fast slash from down low going up at an angle on Hinata's left side, hoping to get past her arm and do enough damage to make the Hyuga heiress withdraw without too much damage done to her person. However, Hinata wasn't planning on making this easy for Sai as her left hand suddenly became coated in chakra that compacted to the point of looking solid. With the dense chakra covering her hand, Hinata slapped the sword away from her and sent her right hand towards Sai's chest. Sai countered by flicking his wrist and slapped Hinata's hand away with the flat side of his tanto. The attack by Hinata's hand was diverted, but Sai was caught off guard by her leg hooking his ankle and dropping him onto the floor. Sai quickly rolled to the side when he saw Hinata's other foot surrounded in chakra and heading straight for his stomach. That action saved himself from contributing to the small crater that Hinata's foot made when it hit the arena tile. Sai retaliated by swinging his tanto at her feet only for the Hyuga to jump over the blade and do a front flip in the air before landing near Sai's head in a crouch, already in motion to hit Sai with a palm strike. Sai rolled avoiding the strike and sent his sword towards Hinata's arm in retaliation, only for it to slide off Hinata's chakra-coated arm, tearing a good chunk of the jacket's arm with it. Hinata jumped back, getting some distance, allowing Sai to get to his feet as she looked at the torn sleeve. Looking at Sai with a steely gaze, she said, I normally don't care about my clothes like some stupid fangirl, but this was my favorite jacket. Sai's unemotional eyes stared at her before they widened slightly as Hinata's chakra peaked and the image of a transparent white tiger suddenly appeared beside her. The tiger roared and Hinata launched herself at Sai. As Hinata began launching an assault that Sai was hard-pressed to defend himself against, Naruto was chuckling to himself as he thought, looks like Hinata's discovered how to tap into her presence. Trust clothes to be a motivation for a girl. I guess I'll have to teach her how to use it properly. Everyone else besides Teammate, the Whirlpool Nin, and the Hokage were wondering just where the tiger had come from and why it had disappeared 10 seconds after it appeared. Sai meanwhile was beginning to sweat from defending himself from Hinata's attacks. Every time he thought he saw an opening and tried to take advantage of it, it turned out to only be a feint and he would barely get his blade into position in time to prevent the girl from getting a hit on his chest. He already had bruises on his arm from where he had been forced to block the girl's hits with flesh, and he could feel his chakra fluctuating between acting like a faucet with a leak to a roaring river that was making his chakra circulation network strain with the rapid differences it was being forced to make. But then Hinata did something that made his fluctuating chakra take a back seat. Sai had just tried to hit her with his tanto again when Hinata had grabbed the blade in a chakra-coated hand and yanked Sai forward, ruining his balance. Before Sai could stumble more than a step though, Hinata's right knee found residence in his stomach, forcing him to exhale as his eyes widened at the loss of air. But before he could counter, Hinata spun on her left leg and slammed a glowing elbow into his back, temporarily paralyzing him before she completed her spin and slammed an axe kick down onto his spine, sending Sai into the floor harder than normal and leaving a small crater in the ground since she had put chakra into the kick. As Sai tried to lift himself up with his arms, everyone watching began muttering as it became apparent that Sai couldn't use his lower body, as he fell back down when his legs wouldn't listen to him. Hinata confirmed their suspicions as she said, don't worry. I made sure not to permanently damage the spine. The paralysis will go away in a few minutes. Naruto saw that there was no way Sai would be able to fight while partially paralyzed and said, Sai is unable to battle. Hinata is the winner. Yeah, you kick-ass Hinata. Hinata blushed at Kiba's shout before she gave a slight wave and began walking toward the stairs while the medics came and began working on getting his temporary paralysis over as soon as possible. Up in the balconies, Niji frowned and thought, it seems that fate was on her side this time. But it will leave her soon enough, and then I'll show her how weak she really is. He saw Naruto's eyes flash towards him as if the blonde had heard his thoughts. The two kept locked gazes until Naruto broke it 10 seconds later and sent chakra in the board seal. Why do I feel like that particular Hyuga has a bigger stick up his ass than the others? Naruto thought before he saw the board finish its selection and said, Riko Uzumaki, Oboro, look alive Genin. Oboro is the member of Team Oboro with both eyes visible. Riko scowled at Naruto before he put a hand on the railing and jumped over while Oboro decided to take the stairs. As the redhead walked towards his blonde clan heir, Riko muttered under his breath, at least I didn't have to wait too long. But why did he have to be the proctor? Everyone down in rank and above heard him and Naruto chuckled before he turned towards Oboro who was taking his time coming and was only halfway down the stairs. Naruto frowned before he seemed to flicker. When he did, Oboro disappeared and reappeared a few inches off the ground with Naruto's hand holding his collar. Dropping the kid back to the ground, Naruto said, Let's go kid. There are a lot more matches after this, so stop keeping us waiting. Besides, it's rude to make your opponent wait longer than necessary. Most of the other occupants of the room sweat dropped while Oboro seemed to send a dirty look at Naruto. They only had his two eyes to tell though since the rest of his face was completely covered. Naruto pointed to the spot in front of Riko and the teenager huffed before he stomped over to his spot. Naruto smirked before he got serious and said, Fifth round, begin. As soon as Naruto was clear, Riko's Katars were out and Oboro was suddenly headless. Or at least his water clone was. As the clone broke apart leaving a puddle of water on the floor, Riko snorted and said, You know, we Uzumakis may be known as chakra monsters, but I can still tell when I've been put under a genjutsu. The Uzumaki's declaration was met with the sound of disembodied chuckling before copies of his opponent seemed to melt out of the floor with kunai in hand. Riko glanced around with a bored look on his face before he started sparking much to most of those who knew of the Uzumaki's surprise. You know, back home I was called the Thunderstorm by my friends. Care to guess why? Riko asked before the sparks surrounding his body suddenly turned into lightning bolts as they blasted the 10 Oboros that surrounded him. As the clones once again turned into water, Riko said, It's because unlike my relatives who only have water or wind natures as their elements, I have lightning as well. Now stop being a coward and get up here. Or would you rather I kill you underground? His answer was an arm coming up from underneath him with a kunai that tried to stab into his leg only for Riko to hook his leg around the blade and kick Oboro out of the ground, thus ending his opponent's underwater fish projection jutsu and sending him crashing into the wall. They really should have come up with a better name for that jutsu. Riko took a moment to look at his slightly cut foot before he blurred through hand signs and said, Lightning style. Lightning kunai jutsu. 8 kunai of electricity formed in the air in front of Riko before he made a gesture with his hand and sent them flying at the stunned Oboro, who was too slow to dodge the high-speed projectiles and ended up pinned with 2 in each limb. Oboro screamed in pain as the electricity poured into his body before the kunai disappeared and he slumped forward unconscious. As Naruto appeared next to him, Riko scoffed and said, What a waste of time. Couldn't even handle a little static shock. And, from this point forward, all matches were chosen randomly by my brother who knows nothing about Naruto. I really should have done this for the first few matches, but I didn't think of it until now. So please don't criticize the list since this is as random as I can get. Naruto sighed at his distant relative before he pushed chakra into his seal again, and the board began doing the only thing that gave meaning to its life. Naruto looked back when the board beeped and said, Sakura Haruno, Misumi Tsurugi, you two are next. Walking over to the beginning spot, Naruto looked up at the leaf balcony and noticed that Sakura seemed a little pale as she made her way down. Glancing to the other balcony showed her veiled opponent making his own way down in a somewhat cocky manner with an evil glint in his eyes. Once both were in front of him, Naruto said, Are both fighters ready? Misumi seemed to smirk behind his veil as he said, Of course. Sakura nervously swallowed before nodding. Naruto nodded as well as he raised his hand and said, 6th round, fight. Naruto jumped clear just as Sakura jumped back as well while sending a brace of shuriken towards Misumi. Misumi simply scoffed before he back-handed the shuriken away with the metal plate sewn into his glove. "Is that the best you've got?" Misumi asked. Sakura bit her lip before throwing down a smoke bomb. The resulting smoke cloud blocked everyone's view of the kunoichi for a few seconds before 4 copies of the girl ran out trying to flank her opponent. Misumi, though, simply scoffed and said, "Clones? Are you really so pathetic that you actually rely on those? Soft physique modification jutsu." As Misumi finished calling out his jutsu's name, he threw his out in a horizontal swiping motion. The arm stretched before it went through the first 3 Sakuras on the left before slamming into the real Sakura and wrapped around her. Misumi yanked his arm back, jerking Sakura towards him. As soon as she was close enough, his other arm and legs wrapped around her body, with the end result being one arm keeping her own arms pinned while his head was behind hers and his other arm around her neck with just enough pressure to make it hard to breathe. "I'm feeling merciful, so I'll give you one chance to yield before I snap your neck," Misumi said, causing Sakura to shudder at the cold malice in her opponent's voice. Cold malice which only further added to the cold fear that Sakura had in her due to the precarious position between life and death that she was in. "I yield," Sakura shouted. Misumi smirked and said, "Smart girl." The next instant Sakura was free and had her hands at her neck, while she took in deep breaths trying to calm her racing heart, while Naruto declared Misumi the winner. As Sakura shakily made her way back to the leaf balcony with Misumi walking smugly ahead of her, Naruto had the board start cycling through names again. Hearing the beep, he turned and announced the next fighters. "Reina Uzumaki, Kin Tsuchi. Will you please come down?" The 2 kunoichi made their way down. Once they were facing each other, Reina looked at her opponent coolly, while Kin had a smirk on her face that practically screamed, "I'm going to make you weep and enjoy every minute of it." Naruto looked between the 2 before he rose his hand and said, "Are you 2 ready?" Getting nods from both, he slashed his hand down and said, "Fight!" As soon as Naruto was clear, Kin launched Senbon needles at Reina, who crouched for a split second before she launched herself upwards in a chakra-laced jump, allowing the needles to pass harmlessly past her. Reina continued upwards before flipping and sticking herself to the ceiling. Kin looked up and shouted, "What's wrong, scaredy cat? Afraid to fight me?" Reina cocked an eyebrow at her opponent as she said, "Not really. I just don't want to be in range of those genjutsu bells you have on your Senbon." Kin's jaw dropped before she shouted, "How do you know about those?" Reina smirked and said, "Because you told me about them when you fought that Leaf team to get your second scroll. For a group who claim to know everything about sound, you really need to work on your awareness skills. Me and my team saw the whole fight, which is how I know that your needles need to be at a certain range of the target to work properly. The worst you can do to me while I'm up here is have blurred vision, and that doesn't really matter since I have jutsu that don't need extreme accuracy to work." Kin glared and said, "Well, all I'm hearing is a scared dog barking to cover up for its lack of bite." Reina smirked before her hands blurred as she went through a chain of hand signs. Ending on the common hand sign for water jutsu, Reina said, "Well, all I'm hearing is a second-rate kunoichi trying to talk big. Water style. Condensation jutsu." The air shimmered as the humidity sky rocketed, causing vapor like mists to form before the mists grew until they merged together to form a slightly dense fog. With her source of water secured, Reina ran through more hand signs before she called out water-style water dragon jutsu, shocking most of the jounin present with her ability to use such a high-level jutsu and with fewer hand signs that was normally required, no less. Tsunami, however, smirked and thought, "That's my girl. Show them why you're the best water-style user of your generation." Meanwhile, as Tsunami was mentally complimenting her niece, the fog in the air compressed before it formed a massive water dragon that sucked all of the moisture from the air as it formed. Once fully formed, yellow eyes seemed to snap open as they appeared before they glared at Kin and let out a roar that caused the room to vibrate and dust to fall from the ceiling. Kin paled before she threw 2 senbon with exploding notes attached at the dragon. Said dragon simply opened its mouth before swallowing the needles. The exploding notes detonated, causing the dragon's form to briefly swell before it returned to its original slim shape. Kin paled even more as the dragon seemed to give an evil chuckle before Reina made a hand gesture and the dragon launched itself at Kin. The impact sent a large dust cloud into the air. When it cleared, it showed an unconscious Kin lying in a large puddle, badly bruised and with all 4 limbs at terribly unnatural angles. The girl was lucky to have not broken her neck. Naruto took one look at the girl before he said, "Reina Uzumaki is the winner." Medics. These whirlpool nin definitely don't mess around. I'm glad we're still allies with them. Sarutobi thought as he pulled the brim of his hat down to cover his eyes for a moment as he began thinking about a new treaty for any more returning Uzumakis. Reina meanwhile dropped down to the floor and landed in a crouch as the white-coated medics rushed past her to asses just how badly she had pummeled her opponent. Reina gave a respectful nod to her clan heir before she turned and walked to the balcony and rejoined her team. As soon as the medics had carted Kin off the floor, Naruto once again began the process of choosing the next fighters. The board beeped and Naruto said, "Zaku Abumi. Kagari. You two are next." As the two foreigners made their way down, Naruto frowned at the sound nin, or at his arms which were both in slings to be more specific. He's actually planning on fighting? I could understand him not forfeiting before the prelims just so he could watch the fights but to actually fight without both arms? This boy is either cocky or faking. He shook those thoughts from his head as the two shinobi settled in front of him. Kagari eyed his opponent's arms and sneered as he said, "You must be really confident in yourself. Do you actually expect to fight me with no arms?" Zaku smirked before his left arm began to shift and he pulled it out, enjoying the look of surprise most of the genin had on their faces. "Well, what do you know? It seems I can use one of my arms. This should be more than enough to deal with you," Zaku said as his smirk turned evil. Naruto mentally sighed before he said, "If you two are done talking macho then, begin." Naruto slashed his arm down and jumped back. The two fighters glared at him for a moment before they shifted focus on each other. Kagari gave an evil chuckle before he began sinking into the ground at a rapid pace. The moment his head disappeared, it seemed to shoot right back up along with copies of him that surrounded Zaku in a 10-man ring. Zaku scoffed at the ring of Kagaris and said, "Looks like you're as cowardly as your teammate. Not that it matters." Decapitating wave. Zaku swung his body around a full 360 degrees as air blasted out of the tube in his arm, blasting apart all of the clones in one move. He smirked, but the smirk quickly left his face as twice as many clones sprung out of the ground. Zaku sked before he repeated his last maneuver, blasting all of the clones as they tried to hit him again. This cycle repeated itself for 5 minutes, becoming redundant, with the only changes being the number of clones sent up and Zaku at some point having brought his right arm out of the sling. And as everybody knows, redundancy breeds boredom. Naruto sighed as another wave of clones was wiped out by a slightly panting Zaku and thought, "This match is nothing more than a battle of attrition to see who has the most chakra. I'm half tempted to just call it a draw and move to the next fight." Two things stopped him from doing just that. One was a small hand gesture from his Kage that told him to let things run through. Why the old man wanted that was beyond him, although he personally thought it was to stall the inevitable paperwork back on the old man's desk. Second was the fact that both shinobi's chakra was quickly nearing their limits, meaning that the fight would probably be over in another minute or two. True to his suspicions, that limit was reached by both a minute later. A panting Zaku dropped to his knees before his face met concrete as he fell forward. 2 seconds later, all of the clones around him burst as the real Kagari slowly emerged from the ground, looking just as exhausted. "Hey, I won. Take that, you sound idiot," Kagari said before he too fell flat on his face, earning sweat drops from most of the genin at how pointless the entire fight seemed. Naruto sighed and said, "Since neither of the two combatants can battle, this is a draw. Neither will continue to the third exam. Now that we have that waste of 6 minutes done, let's see who's fighting next." The medics hoisted the two shinobi off while the board went through its routine again before landing on 2 names. When the board beeped, Naruto looked over his shoulder and said, "Yoroi Akado, Tamari of the Desert, you're up." As the fighting kunoichi turned to walk down from her spot next to her team, her youngest brother said, "Tamari." When he knew he had her attention, he continued, "Don't take too long beating him. I've already spent too long waiting." Tamari swallowed before nodding as she turned and walked down the stairs. The two fighters met in front of Naruto, who looked between the two as he said, "Fighters ready?" 2 nods was his answer, so he raised his hand as he said, "Then 9th round start." Naruto's hand slashed down and he jumped clear just as Yoroi rushed his opponent with his hands glowing. Tamari didn't give him a chance to make contact though, as she whipped her war fan off her back and slammed the end of it into the side of Yoroi's head, sending him flying. Yoroi rolled along the ground before he shakily got back up. But before he could fully orient himself, Tamari flicked her fan open and blasted him with a wind jutsu as she called out, "Great sickle weasel technique." The burst of wind seemed to form sickles inside it before it slammed into Yoroi, who screamed in pain before the wind died down and his eyes rolled to the back of his head as he fell face down bleeding from over 100 cuts. Naruto didn't have to check to know that the fight was over. Pointing to Temari, he said, "Winner, Temari. Medics. Another one who doesn't mess around." The Jounin thought. Unknown to the blonde, most of the other Jounin and the Hokage were thinking the same thing as medics rushed over and began checking Yoroi. Temari meanwhile smirked and walked back to the balcony. Naruto gave them a chance to get the poor sod out of the area before he pulsed chakra into his seal. Hearing the beep from the board, Naruto turned his head and his eyebrow rose as he thought, talk about coincidences. Turning his head back forward, he said, "Kankuro of the desert, Niji Hyuga. Will you two please come down?" The two made their way down and Naruto had trouble figuring out which one seemed to be the more cocky of the two. When they were both in front of him, Kankuro took off the mummified figure from his back and slammed it into the ground next to him as he said, "This shouldn't take too long." Niji smirked and said, "I agree. Fate has decreed that I shall win." Kankuro gained a tick mark over his right eyebrow. But before the one with makeup could retort, Naruto sighed and said, "Since you two seem ready to go, 10th round start." As Naruto jumped away, Niji activated his Byakugan and smirked as he said, "Do you really plan on fighting me while you can't see anything?" All of the genin wondered what he was talking about before the wrapped bundle came undone and everyone saw another Kankuro appear. Looking at Niji with a raised eyebrow, the second Kankuro said, "Well, I guess there's no need to keep up the charade. But you're going to wish you had." The first Kankuro shimmered before it turned into a battle puppet which rattled before it launched itself at Niji. Niji frowned before he began dodging the various blades that unfolded from the puppet's body. Catching sight of the poison on the blades only confirmed Niji's opinion that he didn't want to get cut by them. Kankuro smirked thinking he had his opponent completely on the defensive. Niji, however, was keeping half his attention on the puppet itself while focusing the other half on where Kankuro's chakra strings were connected to the puppet. He had to make sure he knew exactly where each one was when he made his move. 10 seconds later, Niji stopped dodging and began hitting the puppet with hard palm strikes. Kankuro scoffed and was about to ask what good that did when the areas Niji hit exploded into wood chips as Niji applied one of the principles of tree climbing. Namely the fact that if you put too much chakra into what you try to stick to, that thing explodes from the chakra overload. Kankuro stared in horror as his puppet fell to the ground in pieces. Niji's attack had blasted straight through the wood, where Kankuro's chakra strings had been attached from the back. Without any wood for the strings to attach to the puppet had fallen like the puppet whose strings had been cut it was. There was barely anything left of the arms and legs for Kankuro to send chakra strings to. Not that Niji would let him since the Hyuga was now standing between him and his beloved puppet smirking at him. "I would forfeit if I were you. Fate has decreed that I shall win here and you are already at a disadvantage." Kankuro scowled before he reached into the pouch on his waist and pulled out what looked like a custom-made kunai that had a sheath on it that Kankuro pulled off and stuck back in his pouch. What made it look custom was the fact that the handle had no ring at its end and was slightly thicker than usual. The slight glistening of liquid on the now exposed blade gave everyone a clue as to why the handle was thicker. It was obviously to store a liquid of some kind that could soak the kunai's blade. Kankuro flipped the kunai in his hand so that it was in a reverse grip and took a ready stance. Niji closed his eyes and shook his head as he said, "Do you really think you stand a chance with that? What a fool." Niji's eyes snapped open before he rushed Kankuro's position, ready to teach the sand nin that you shouldn't use a knife when fighting a Hyuga, but a 4.5-foot-long claymore instead. As soon as he was in range, Kankuro swung his blade hoping to at the very least nick his opponent and at the very most take his pound of flesh. In a move similar to what his cousin did during her fight, Niji coated his arm with condensed chakra, deflected the attack by pushing on the flat of the blade before he smirked and said, "You're in my range. Gentle fist 8 trigrams, 64 palms." Niji let loose a fierce barrage of palm strikes, causing Kankuro to yell in pain before he deactivated his Byakugan and took a step back. Kankuro groaned before he fell sideways and crashed onto the ground. Niji turned and started walking away as he said, "Proctor, call the match. He isn't getting back up on his own." Naruto sent a quick pulse of chakra out and when he saw the puppeteer's chakra network had to agree. It was barely registering as resisting Naruto's pulse, which was how Naruto registered how much chakra an opponent had when he formed his fields of chakra. Add to the fact that it felt like the human body's second circulatory system felt like it was broken into several pieces, Naruto had to acknowledge Niji's claim. Naruto quickly declared Niji the winner before gesturing to the medics who rushed over and quickly began working on restoring Kankuro's chakra network to what it should be even as they moved him off the floor. One of the medics thoughtfully sealed Kankaro's busted puppet before joining his comrades as they carried the puppeteer off in a stretcher. Once the floor was clear, Naruto set the board back to work and called out its next selection. Kiba Inuzuka, Rock Lee. Will you two please come down? Yash, I finally get to show everyone my flames of youth, Lee said as he hopped over the railing and practically jogged over to Naruto, earning sweat drops from almost everyone but his sensei, who seemed to be encouraging his students' behavior. I have to fight that guy? Kiba asked before he sighed and took the stairs like a normal person. The people who also had jumped the rail before his fight didn't count since they were at the end of the balcony and so were farther from the staircase than he was. As Kiba made his way down at a reasonable pace, Lee began bouncing on his heels and then stretching and then switching back to bouncing on his heels numerous times, earning even more sweat drops from the other normal people. Seriously, is there really a normal shinobi out there? When Kiba joined the other two on the floor, Naruto raised his hand and said, "Fighters ready?" Getting a nod from Kiba as his partner Akamaru jumped off his head and an excited, "Yash!" from Lee, Naruto dropped his hand and jumped back as he said, "11th round start." As soon as the words were out of the proctor's mouth, Lee blurred straight at Kiba and hit him with a punch to the chest so strong it sent Kiba a foot into the wall behind the dog user. Akamaru barked and rushed to Kiba's form and whined as he tried to pull out his master by grabbing one of his pant legs in his teeth. Lee's eyes bugged out at the sight of the unconscious Inuzuka as he said, "Ah, my flames of youth snuffed out my opponents." Everyone's sweat dropped again before Naruto cleared his throat and said, "Winner Lee, medics." The medics took a few minutes to get Kiba's body out of the wall before they carted him off. Everyone winced at the blood that was visible as it stained the back of his coat and wondered how in the world he survived such an impact. What can I say? I like most of the Rookie 9 too much to kill them so heartlessly. Once the wall was Kiba free and the medics had retreated, Naruto activated the seal and the board began going through names. Once it had its selection, Naruto said, "Shikamaru Nara, Eren Raku. You guys are up." Naruto flickered before reappearing with Shikamaru beside him. Shikamaru shook his head before glaring at Naruto, who simply rose an eyebrow before turning to the second fighter, who got the message and walked just a little bit faster to the stairs. Said shinobi was a little taller than Shikamaru and like his teammate seemed to prefer taijutsu. Once both were in front of him, Naruto said, "Fighters ready?" Eren nodded while Shikamaru gave a muttered troublesome before nodding. Naruto slashed his hand down as he said, "Fight!" Eren didn't waste any time getting clear of Shikamaru's expanding shadow as it rushed towards him. As he took a giant leap back and to his right, he saw that Shikamaru's lazy look had been traded for one of determination. Landing and taking another jump back, Eren said, I hate Naras. Even though they're lazy asses off the battlefield, you can always expect them to come up with some plan and or do something that will screw you over if you have to fight them." Shikamaru gave a non-committal grunt before his shadow shot past where his opponent had been after his first jump and connected with the shadow from the foreign side balcony. The combined shadow then surged towards Eren, who cursed and jumped away saying, "See, that's what I'm talking about." Shikamaru's lips twitched before the shadow continued its path and connected with the balcony on the other side of the room. Eren looked at the two groups of shadows that began to quiver as they began stretching towards him, encircling the IWA shinobi. A panting Shikamaru smirked at his opponent and said, "I suggest you forfeit before I make you do something that would be terribly embarrassing." Eren looked around him at the wide circle of shadows that surrounded him and considered his options, which sadly were few in number. He could either try and jump to the ceiling and hope that the shadows couldn't connect to his while he was up there. He could allow the shadows to connect to him and be seriously embarrassed. Or he could keep most of his dignity by forfeiting. Raising his hand, Eren said, "I forfeit." Naruto shrugged and said, "Eren forfeits, so Shikamaru wins." The shadows shot back to the balconies as Shikamaru tiredly walked back to the leaf balcony. When he reached his team, Chuji handed him a bag and he took a pill out of it while thanking him. Naruto meanwhile started the selection process for the next fight, causing the board to start cycling through names. It gave its selection a lot faster now that it only had 6 more names to go through, and Naruto called out, "Will Kabuto Yakushi and Chuji Akimichi please come down? He doesn't look too bad. At least I won't be knocked into the wall." Chuji said, glad that he wouldn't have to fight someone like Lee or the last Nin who looked really scary. A hand clapping itself on his shoulder drew his attention to Asuma, who smiled and said, "Hey Chuji, if you win, I'll take you to that new barbecue restaurant for an all-you-can-eat." Chuji's eyes widened before they filled with determination as he turned and began marching toward the stairs, while his teammates commented on how low it was to bribe Chuji with food like that. Kabuto meanwhile simply pushed his glasses further up his nose as he walked down the stairs. As the two met in front of Naruto, Chuji glared at Kabuto and said, "I'm going to beat you. The meat demands it." As Kabuto gave his opponent an amused look, everyone else sweat dropped as Naruto thought, "Great. And Akimichi who actually believes his food is a deity." Shaking that thought from his head, he said, "Combatants ready?" Getting two nods in response, Naruto raised his hand before he slashed it down and said, "Start." As soon as Naruto was clear, Chuji roared before his arm expanded, and he launched a punch at Kabuto, who simply smiled before he jumped over the punch and landed on Chuji's arm. Running up the arm, Kabuto reached Chuji's face in seconds and kicked Chuji, forcing his head back as Chuji stumbled back. Kabuto landed on the floor before he crouched low and swept Chuji's feet from out under him. As soon as Chuji hit the floor, he had a kunai at his neck. He followed the hand that held the blade to see Kabuto's smiling face looking down at him. "I would yield if I were you. You are at a disadvantage fighting someone who's trained to be able to avoid any attacks," Kabuto said. Chuji swallowed before he rose his hand and said, "I forfeit." Chuji has forfeited. Therefore Kabuto is the winner, Naruto said. Kabuto quickly put his kunai away before he held a hand out to Chuji, who hesitated for a moment before he accepted the help and was hoisted to his feet. As Chuji walked back to the balcony with his head down and Kabuto walked away without making a scene, Naruto used the seal and started the board again. It took 30 seconds before it beeped out the second to last pair of fighters and Naruto called out, "Dosu Kenyuta, Gaara of the desert. You two are next." A whirlwind of sand appeared in front of Naruto. When it died down, Gaara was in its place. The redhead glared at Dosu, who seemed to be taking his time coming down. Once he joined the two Jinchuriki, Naruto said, "Fighters ready?" "Yes, get on with it," Gaara said as killing intent began to slowly but surely fill the room. Dosu nodded as well and Naruto began the match before disappearing and reappearing beside his leader. The two would most likely die before they told anyone, but both were glad that it was a sound Nin fighting the foreign Jinchuriki. The contact Jiraiya had talked to before coming back to the Leaf Village with its own Jinchuriki had told him that Orochimaru had ties to the Sound Village. In their minds, anyone who had connections to that scumbag was welcome to fight the Sand Jinchuriki, since that meant none of their people had to. As the two were mentally thanking the electronic board for not choosing an allied shinobi to fight the unstable Jinchuriki, Gaara had been busy. As soon as Naruto had disappeared, his sand blasted out of his gourd and rushed Dosu, who had rapidly retreated. As soon as Dosu dodged the first stream of sand, he flicked the melody gauntlet on his right arm, sending sound waves out which he directed at Gaara. Gaara's left hand suddenly clapped against his ear. His eyes narrowed at his opponent before the cool gaze turned into a glare and the sand that was hovering around him all shot forward a second time. Dosu tried to jump away a second time, but the sand formed into the shape of a hand which backhanded the mummified figure, sending him rolling across the floor. As soon as Dosu's figure had stopped rolling, the same hand of sand grabbed his right leg and lifted him into the air before it began swinging around in a circle. It did this for 5 cycles before the hand slammed Dosu's body back down onto the floor, cracking the concrete. As Dosu tried to get the cobwebs out of his head, more sand joined the hand and began covering him with it. As Dosu's body became fully covered by sand, it lifted him up until his body was floating a few feet above the ground. Gaara meanwhile had a hand held out as he said, "Pathetic. Desert coffin." The sand coffin imploded, crushing everything in its grasp. Or it would have if there was anything in it. Gaara's eyes widened the smallest fraction as he saw the coffin do its job without spilling any blood. They widened further when the sand dispersed and Naruto was revealed with an unconscious Dosu being held by the collar of his shirt and wind swirling around the two in a small vortex that was spinning lazily. Dosu is unable to fight anymore. Therefore Gaara is the winner, Naruto said as he gestured to the medics to take the unconscious Sound Nin from him. He may have preferred a Sound Nin fighting the Jinchuriki, but that didn't mean he would let one of the fighters die if he could help it. Gaara's eyes narrowed before he growled out, "You shall not interfere. I will prove my existence." Gaara's sand reared up before lashing out at the blonde like a cobra. Naruto's own eyes narrowed before the lazy vortex turned fierce as the wind circled around Naruto one more time before it rushed the sand and blasted it apart into a thin cloud of floating silicone. Naruto then disappeared before he reappeared on Gaara's right side, holding his right hand towards the redhead as he said, "Wind style. Wind prison jutsu." As the calm words left the blonde's mouth, The air in the room turned into wind a second time and converged on Gaara's location. Within a second, the redhead was trapped in a sphere of wind which lifted him up a foot in the air. As Gaara's sand rushed towards the blonde in retaliation, Naruto brought his left hand up under his outstretched right arm and blasted the sand away with a seal-less gale palm. The wind blasted the sand back while simply ruffling the approaching medic's coats. Turning his attention back to his prisoner, Naruto said, "This fight is over, Genin. Now stand down before I siphon all of the air out of your lungs." The blonde was only planning on knocking out the redhead, but he didn't need to know that. Gaara glared at the blonde, and for a moment the blonde thought he would have to carry out his threat. Then the sand dropped down on the floor. Naruto kept the prison up for a moment longer before he cut the chakra flow from the jutsu, causing the wind to disperse and drop the redhead back to the floor. Naruto walked back to his starting position as the sand rushed back to the redhead, who glared at the blonde for a moment before he too turned and walked to the balcony, ignoring the medics who had by that time grabbed Dosu and walked out of the doors. Naruto waited until Gaara was walking up the stairs before he said, "Mubi, Tenten. Get down here, you two." As the last two contestants made their way down, Naruto mentally thanked the log that the prelims were almost over. It had been stressful enough worrying about what Orochimaru was doing. He didn't need the additional stress that came from these 15 matches. Naruto shook his head free of thoughts of night patrols of the village and its surrounding areas to try and find the traitorous bastard when the last two fighters positioned themselves in front of him. Looking at the two, he said, "Are you two ready?" Getting two nods as a response. Naruto rose his hand and said, "Then let the final preliminary round start." Chopping down his hand and jumping back, Naruto watched as Mubi tried to sink into the ground, only for Tenten to rush forward and slam a foot into his face, sending him flying as she shouted, "Dynamic entry." Tenten rushed to his fallen form and kicked him in the stomach, sending him up into the air. As soon as he was high enough, Tenten slammed a chakra-coated fist into his ribs. Everyone winced as they heard at least one rib break, and Mubi screamed in pain. As he fell back onto the floor again, Tenten pushed chakra into a small seal on her right hand, causing a ninjato to puff into existence. Tenten swung the ninjato at the downed Rain ninja, and a large but superficial cut appeared across his stomach. Not letting up, Tenten unsealed a tanto from the seal on her left hand and slashed into a rising Mubi's right arm. Mubi gritted his teeth to keep from screaming again and tried to lash out with a kunai, only for Tenten to slap the smaller blade out of her opponent's hands with the tanto before she stabbed her ninjato into his left shoulder. Before Mubi even had a chance to scream, she twisted the blade so that it was horizontal and ripped it out of his shoulder in a horizontal swing, making that arm useless. Mubi had no time to worry about that, though, as the tanto was moving to take off his head. A sharp clanging sound filled the air as the flat side of a kunai held in a reverse grip intercepted the blade. Tenten jumped slightly as Naruto appeared beside Mubi and blocked her swing a mere inch from taking off her opponent's head. "I've seen enough. Winner, Tenten." Mubi slumped as Tenten took a step back and Naruto lowered his kunai. To her, it seemed ridiculous that the proctor had stepped in like he did. Saving someone from that scary Sannin was one thing, but him stepping in like that for her fight just felt wrong. She wasn't going to actually decapitate her opponent, just cut into the neck a little. She had her blade angled so it would avoid the main arteries and veins so he wouldn't have bled to death. She was brought out of those thoughts as Naruto looked at the two balconies and said, "Well, everyone who has won their fights, please come down. We are about to choose the fights for the final rounds next month." Naruto walked over to where the Hokage and his entourage had retaken their spots in front of the Ram statue and was joined a minute later by all of the winners sans Sasuke. Turning around to face them, Naruto pointed the thumb of his right hand over his shoulder at Anko, who held a box in her hands, as he said, "We'll now decide the third exams lineup. Anko here is going to come to each of you. You will take one paper and only one paper from the box as she reaches you. Anko, if you'd please." Anko quickly walked the line, allowing everyone to get a slip of paper. When she was done, Naruto said, "On your paper you will find a number. Starting on my right, going to my left, call out your numbers." The genin did as told, starting with the Sand team. Gaara, 14. Temari, 9. Hinata, 1. Shino, 3. Niji, 2. Lee, 6. Tenten, 10. Riko, 4. Reina, 7. Rachel, 12. Misumi, 5. Kabuto, 11. Shikamaru, 8. As the genin called out their numbers, Ibiki wrote them down on his clipboard. Once everyone was finished, he said, "That leaves the Uchiha kid with 13. Taking the paper off of the clipboard, the head of INT handed it to Naruto, who flipped it in his hands so that the genin could see it and said, "This will be the matchup for the finals that are to be held in 1 month. Hinata Hyuga will fight Niji Hyuga in the first round. That fight will be followed by Shino Aburame versus Riko Uzumaki. After that is Misumi Tsurugi versus Rock Lee. Next round will be Reina Uzumaki against Shikamaru Nara. Then we have Temari of the Desert versus Tenten. The second to last match will be Kabuto Yakushi against Rachel Aliston. And finally, the final match will be Sasuke Uchiha versus Gaara of the Desert. Winners of these matches will fight the winner of the match after theirs until there is only one winner. Know that while the final exam will take place as a tournament, that does not mean only one of you can become Chunin. It just means that that person had more chances to show the judges why he or she deserves to be Chunin. You could all earn that rank or none of you could be promoted. This is a chance to show our judges and everyone else that you have what it takes to climb the ladder. You have 1 month to prepare. I suggest you do so, and in a month's time make all of us proud to have you alongside us in the ranks of shinobi." Dismissed. Preliminary rounds end. Dismissed. At the end of Naruto's little speech, the genin broke apart their line and began walking towards their Jounin sensei. Most had thoughts of how they would fight their opponents in a month, while a select few were relishing the fact that they were fighting who they were. Naruto, meanwhile, watched Hinata walk away with a thoughtful look on his face. "Ryo, for your thoughts." Naruto looked to his right, where his village leader was now standing beside him with his trusty pipe already smoking. Naruto looked back at Hinata, who was currently walking to the double doors with Kurenai and Shino. Sighing, Naruto said, "Old man, is it wrong that I feel like I should be the one to train Hinata this month?" Sarutobi rose an eyebrow as he looked at his fastest Jounin and said, "Does this have anything to do with that presence she displayed during her match?" Naruto shrugged and said, "Partly, but that's only part of the reason. But for the life of me, I can't figure out the other part." Sarutobi chuckled and thought to himself, "Seems Naruto is a bit attracted with our young Hyuga heir. Whether that attraction will turn into something else is yet to be seen. Well, I'm sure that we could arrange for that, although it might be hard convincing her father to allow it. But I'm sure he'll agree when I tell him why you want to train her. After all, being able to use your presence in battle is a very rare skill." Naruto shot an incredulous look at his leader and said, "But isn't that against the rules though? I mean, that would be a conflict of interest, wouldn't it?" Sarutobi chuckled again and said, "You let me worry about that. You just worry about what you're going to teach her for this month. I will let you know when I'm successful." Doing a 180 and switching into his leader persona, he continued as he said, "I want you to find Jiraiya sometime this week and tell him I want you to sign the Toad contract. I've told him to expect you. If Sans Jinchuriki does use the One Tail's power during the finals, and the 5-pronged seal doesn't work for whatever reason, you'll have a way to combat its full possession mode." Naruto nodded his head and disappeared. Sarutobi sighed and said, "Now it's back to that dreadful paperwork." Giving another sigh, the old shinobi disappeared in a whirlwind of leaves. Scene change, Waterfall 15. Naruto reappeared at Waterfall 15, a training ground that was further from the village than all of the other training grounds, including the other 14 waterfall training grounds. They were called as such due to the waterfall in each one, with one the closest to the village. People rarely used them, which was precisely why Naruto had asked his partner to meet him here. Naruto took one glance at the waterfall at the end of the clearing, where he could hear girls squealing at the bottom of the falls beneath their elevation, wondering who had the stamina to actually hike that far, before he turned to where his partner was currently locked in battle with 10 water clones that kept forming ice mirrors every other minute to attack the original from every angle. As Haku dodged a rather large ice spear that shot out of a mirror, he saw his partner walking toward the fight and dismissed his clones, causing all of them to burst into water and their jutsu to dissipate. Walking out of the large ring of puddles that action caused, Haku smiled and said, "You wanted to see me, Naruto?" Naruto nodded and said, "Yeah, I think it's time we worked on taking your crystal ice mirrors to the next stage." Haku cocked his head and said, "What do you mean?" Naruto gestured at the puddles where Haku's water clones had made ice mirrors and said, "You can make a dome of mirrors to surround a small number of opponents. You can also make a single pair of mirrors that are far apart to cover long distances faster. I think it's time we worked on merging those two methods so that you can take on larger groups of people in a bigger area." Haku nodded in understanding before he switched topics and said, "So how did the preliminaries go?" Naruto shrugged and said, "As well as can be expected. All 3 of Aunt Tsunami's team made it through. And somehow or another the old man has made me responsible for training Hinata for this month when she showed she could form a semi-corporal presence. Haku's eyebrow rose as he said, "Wouldn't that be a conflict of interest?" Naruto's lips quirked upwards as he said, "I asked him that exact same thing. He told me to let him worry about that. Also, he told me to find Jiraiya again so that I can sign the Toad contract. I plan on doing that tomorrow. I'll probably bring both him and Hinata here, so that way we have some privacy while we train." Haku nodded before a thoughtful look passed through his eyes as he said, "Just out of curiosity, Naruto, what did Hinata's presence feel like?" Naruto actually smirked this time as he said, "Look like, not feel like." She manifested a transparent image of a white tiger for 10 seconds. Haku's eyes widened as she said, "She has an actual physical presence? Not just something that's effects are physical around the person's body." Naruto nodded and said, "So it seems, although we will have to see if it can actually cause physical damage or if it's just limited to a great distraction when I show her how to draw it out and keep it up during an actual fight." "Naruto, this could be really big. Zabuza told me that as far as he knew, presences were used only for mental intimidation. According to him, no one has ever been able to make an actual physical presence that could physically harm their opponents." Naruto's face sprouted a fox-like grin as he said, "Well, if we're right, then Hinata's going to revolutionize presence manipulation." Scene change, Hokage's office, 8 a.m. Hinata resisted the urge to fidget as she stood beside her father wondering why they were here. The two were currently standing in front of the Hokage's desk. The person behind said desk had a smirk on his face since he knew that even though he would never show it, Hayashi was extremely annoyed at how Sarutobi had convinced him to allow this to happen. He didn't care if Hinata showed extreme amounts of potential to use her presence. The task of a Hyuga being trained to fight another Hyuga for a month should be kept inside the clan, not given to an outsider. Hayashi tried to ignore the fact that only Uzumaki and possibly the foreign Uzumaki Jounin sensei could use said presences, but that just made him even more annoyed that none of the other Hyugas seemed to have what it took to use the skill. Mrs. Reina's voice filtered through the intercom, making Hinata jump slightly as she said, "Sir, Jounin Uzumaki is here saying that he has an appointment with you." Sarutobi nodded to himself as he pushed the send button on his intercom and said, "Thank you. Please send him in." The secretary gave an affirmative before the door opened and Naruto walked in. As soon as the door was closed, he found Hayashi in front of him. Naruto rose an eyebrow and said, "Can I help you, Lord Hayashi?" Hayashi's eyes narrowed the slightest millimeter as he said, "There is actually. I do not appreciate outsiders messing with clan business. The only reason why I have agreed to this is the fact that none of my clansmen can do what Hinata apparently can, and you can teach her how to control it. But make no mistake, if I find out anything happens to her, then there will be consequences. Am I understood?" "Perfectly. Now if you'll please excuse me," Naruto said before he sidestepped the clan leader and pulled out a scroll from his Jounin vest and put it on his leader's desk as he said, "Here are the files on the Land of Tea from the daimyo you needed, sir. He's expecting a message about why you wanted them so quickly." Hayashi's teeth gritted slightly at the perceived slight against him, but simply walked out of the door as Sarutobi thanked his Jounin. Hinata, meanwhile, allowed her confusion to show on her face as soon as her father was out of the room. Twiddling her fingers as an old habit she thought she had gotten rid of, she asked, "Excuse me, Lord Hokage?" Sarutobi looked up from the unsealed documents and smiled at Hinata and said, "Yes, Hinata?" Hinata's fingers began fidgeting more as she said, "Why am I here? Father wouldn't tell me. He simply told me that he expected nothing but success from me." Naruto rose an eyebrow and said, "So he just dragged you here without telling you anything? Yeesh, talk about being tight-lipped." Sarutobi gave a half-grunt, half-chuckle in agreement before he said, "The reason why you are here, Hinata, is because Naruto will be training you for the month before the Chunin exams finals." Instead of clearing things up, the Hokage's statement seemed to only make her confusion grow as she asked, "Why would Naruto train me?" "Because during your match you showed that you could access your soul's presence. I plan on making it so that that wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime thing. But it's not just presence training that I'll give you. I plan on giving your speed an extreme boost and help you tweak the gentle fist style so that it fits you better," Naruto said. Hinata blinked before her face scrunched up as she tried to think of when she could have possibly used her presence. As she remembered yesterday's preliminaries, specifically her fight, she remembers hearing a roar beside her that she had ignored since she had been so angry at Sai for ruining her favorite coat. Hinata's eyes opened to see a smirking Naruto who said, "Do you remember now?" I think so," Hinata said, stuttering since she wasn't sure what that roar was. Naruto nodded and walked towards the door as he said, "Well then, let's go. There's one more person we need to find before we can head to Waterfall 15 to begin training." Scene change: Village Hot Springs. Hinata had followed Naruto through the streets of the village until they had reached the hot springs. Hinata wondered why they were here but kept her questions to herself as her superior walked right past the entrances to the different sides of the springs and instead began walking along the fence that surrounded the female side. Hinata followed, although she began wondering if Naruto was actually a peeping Tom. Before those thoughts could take hold in her head though, she heard Naruto say, "There he is." Before she could ask who was, she heard perverted giggling coming from a group of nearby bushes. As the two stopped about 5 feet from the bushes, Naruto raised a finger to his lips in the universal sign for be quiet before he reached into his kunai pouch and withdrew a weird kunai. The kunai was weird in the fact that the blade had the halves of another kunai blade wielded on each of its sides, making the blade look like a giant Phillips head screwdriver. Before Hinata could study the blade for more than a moment, Naruto took out a piece of paper and a pen and quickly jotted something down before he attached it to the ring of the strange kunai and then briefly joined the slipstream. A millisecond later, Hinata heard Naruto's voice say, "1,000 years of death, kunai version." A loud yell of pain followed as a 50-year-old male with long white hair was sent flying out of the bushes holding his rear end before he went over the wall and landed in the water with a splash. Hinata stared at Naruto, who walked out of the bushes as another scream. This one far more girly sounded from the other side of the fence, along with the sound of a lot of angry females punishing a pervert. Naruto gave a chuckle at the look on Hinata's face and said, "Don't worry, he'll be fine. Now let's go, he'll know where to find us." The next thing Hinata knew, she was in a clearing with a river flowing past that ended in a waterfall. Shaking her head as her brain tried to comprehend the sudden change of scenery, her attention was quickly brought to in front of her again as she heard a familiar voice say, "Hello, Hinata-san. How are you this morning?" Hinata's eyes snapped over to see Haku walking towards her and Naruto. She smiled and said, "Hello, Haku-san." Hinata's eyes were then drawn to Haku's shoulder when a flash of light shone. Seeing the flash as well, Naruto looked and saw a sword made completely out of ice on her shoulder glistening in the sun that had just come out of the clouds. The sword was bent 2/3 along the blade with what looked like a weighted tip at the end. Naruto smirked at his partner as he said, "I thought we were supposed to be working on your crystal ice mirror jutsu, Haku. So why do you have a sword? Better yet, why do you have a killage?" Haku smiled and said, "My clone was working on manifesting my ice in different ways and made this." Before Naruto could comment further on that, he felt a whirlwind of leaves appear behind him before it died down, revealing a pissed toad sage who was currently glaring at Naruto's back. "Care to explain to me why you shoved a 4-sided kunai into my ass?" Jiraiya growled out as killing intent began filling the air, making Hinata gulp. "I believe I had told you the last time I caught you peeking on women in the bathhouses that the next time I did I would use Uncle Kakashi's jutsu on you with my own little twist to it. You knew due to the current situation with the foreign Jinchuriki in the village that I would eventually be ordered to come find you so that you can teach me to summon. Therefore you should have waited until you were out of town to do your so-called research," Naruto said as he turned around with a deadpan look on his face. Jiraiya growled as he considered showing Naruto why he should respect his superiors but sighed and slumped his shoulders as he knew that he would never be able to land a blow on the blonde. So instead, he chose to turn around and stomp to the river so that he could sulk. Naruto watched him walk away for a moment before he turned back to Haku and Hinata, who were staring at him. Naruto's eyebrow rose as he said, "What?" Haku's right eye gained a twitch as he said, "You shoved a kunai up a Sanin's rear end?" Naruto shrugged and said, "In all fairness, I did warn him." Ignoring the fact that now both of Haku's eyes were twitching, the blonde quickly made 2 shadow clones and said, "All right guys, I want the 2 of you to work with Haku and Hinata for a while. Whichever one of you gets Hinata needs to put resistance seals on her and walk her through the theory of presence manipulation. The other one should help Haku in getting a larger radius with his ice mirrors." The 2 clones gave salutes and the one closest to Hinata tapped her shoulder and made a follow me gesture while he walked away, while the other clone jerked his head in the opposite direction and started walking that way with Haku. Naruto watched them go for a moment before he turned and walked over to his sulking godfather. As he reached him, he said, "So are you ready to teach me how to summon?" Jiraiya looked over his shoulder and glared at the blonde as he said, "And why would I do that after what you pulled?" I can still feel where that kunai was shoved up my ass. Give me one reason why I shouldn't just leave right now." Naruto rose an eyebrow and said, "Maybe because it was all a genjutsu?" Jiraiya opened his mouth before what the blonde said sunk in, and his eyes narrowed before they widened, and he disrupted his chakra. As soon as he did, the pain in his rear end suddenly left, and Naruto smirked as he said, "It's surprising what a combination of genjutsu and a simply good kick in the pants can do." Jiraiya's eyes narrowed again as he muttered something about how old he must be getting for a genjutsu like that to slip by him. Then an evil gleam appeared in his eyes as he said, "All right, kid. You want to know about summoning? Well, I'll teach you everything you'll ever want to know about the subject. And then some." With Hinata. Naruto's clone led Hinata to the edge of the woods that surrounded the clearing and sat down in the shade under one of the trees, while gesturing for Hinata to sit in front of him. Once Hinata was sitting in front of him, the clone began allowing some of his presence loose, making Hinata feel like she was in an ocean with a strong breeze blowing around her. What you are currently feeling is the presence that most, if not all, Uzumakis have. Due to the fact that we all have wind and water as our strongest elemental nature alignments, our presences tends to lean towards things related to the ocean and storms, usually combinations of the two. A person who has mastered the skill of presence manipulation can control how much the people around them feel, and even make the presence's effects around the creator physical to further intimidate their opponents. You saw an example of this when Boss and Kuroda fought during that bandit raid mission of yours. When Hinata nodded, showing that she understood so far, Naruto's clone continued. Your presence seems to be different than what we've encountered before. When you unlocked it for those 10 seconds, instead of us having a feeling of a tiger of some sort looking at us, we actually saw a transparent image of a white tiger. This leads Haku and Boss to believe that you may be able to physically manifest your presence in a way that it would affect everyone around you and not just you yourself. If this is true, you could potentially use your presence to help you in a fight physically as well as mentally. Hinata blinked and asked, "But how do I use my presence? Yesterday at my fight, I didn't even know I had did it." Naruto smirked as he began making hand signs. Ending on Ram, he took his right hand and gently poked Hinata's forehead with his pointer and middle fingers as he said, "Will, for starters, your mind and soul need to have a nice long chat." Hinata's mindscape. Hinata opened her eyes to find herself in what looked like a meditation rock garden that was in the middle of a circular lake. Looking around, she saw a red oriental bridge behind her which led to a forest. Looking back forward showed a small strip of land separating the lake from an ocean that surrounded the lake on 3 sides. A sudden growling noise caused her to spin around and look back towards the forest as a glowing figure walked out on 4 legs. The figure seemed to look right at her before it turned around and walked back into the forest. Feeling like the figure wanted her to follow it, Hinata walked quickly over the bridge and into the forest where the figure had indeed waited for her. As she got closer, the glow died down slightly, as if the figure didn't want to blind her, and Hinata saw that the figure was a white tiger with a tinge of green in its fur. The tiger waited until Hinata was practically right next to it before it stretched and began walking through the forest with its tail flicking occasionally. They weren't walking for more than a minute before they came upon a sunken hole in the ground with a shallow slope leading down into its dark recesses. The tiger walked down and slipped into the darkness without pause. Hinata, however, paused for a moment before she hurried after it. Once she was at the bottom of the slope, she saw that the inside of the cave actually had 2 silver orbs of light, keeping the 10-foot-long cave well lit. Hinata's head cocked to the side in confusion, since even though there was an exit slope at the end, there wasn't any sign of a second opening back above ground. Her confusion was made even worse when they exited the small cave and came out in an octagon-shaped shrine of some kind. But what really caught her attention was the shelf-like beds that were along the walls, or rather, the tigers that were all laying down on the beds. As Hinata stared at each tiger, she noticed that each one had a different colored tint to it. There was yellow, orange, red, gray, pink, lavender, and bronze. The green tiger made the final color as it walked over to its shelf and hopped up onto it. But before Hinata could wonder what each color meant, a tiger's roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room sounded from the roof, and all of the room's occupants looked up to the ceiling where a shelf was hanging suspended over them all by 8 chains. A pure white tiger leaped off the shelf and landed in front of Hinata, who stumbled back as the tiger rose to its full height and seemed to grin at her. Then everything Hinata ever knew about animals was thrown completely out of whack as the tiger opened its mouth and said, "Welcome, Hinata. We've been expecting you." With Haku. Haku followed Naruto's clone until they were near the waterfall. Once there, The clone plopped down and gestured for Haku to join him. Once the other boy was on the ground, Naruto said, "Alright, boss has been thinking on how to make this work and he thinks he's come up with something. He believes that for this to work you need to redesign the shape that your mirrors make. A dome is good for taking out small numbers, but boss wants you to be able to take out numbers that are closer to around at least 100 and in a much larger range as well. To do this, he believes that a wheel on its side is a better option. Observe." Naruto gestured to the nearby river and manipulated some of the water to come at him in a stream before he flicked his hand in a circle, and the steam rushed at him faster before it turned in on itself, turning into a circle between the two boys. The clone then made a series of flicking motions and the wheel broke into segments which quickly changed shape in order to represent Haku's mirrors, while small flecks of water moved to the middle to represent enemies. Finally, the clone gave a spinning motion with its hand and the water began revolving as the blonde began speaking again. For obvious reasons, you should only use this when you have a relatively open space. The circumference should be big enough to encompass the enemies with at least 10 feet separating the enemies on the edge from the mirrors themselves. The mirrors themselves will have to be tweaked a bit as well. The blonde manipulated the water, causing it to regroup and form a single miniature mirror that was facing him before he began tweaking its appearance. Once he was done, the clone blasted it with a burst of wind, freezing the mirror, and set it in a slow rotation to show Haku. The mirror looked like a lens for a lighthouse, with a curved back that showed the ice user's reflection multiple times in its face that was bent inward to have a slight U-shape if looking at from above. The blonde allowed his creator's partner to study the mirror for a moment before he said, "This is what boss believes the new mirror should look close to. He believes that the inwardly dented panels will allow you better angles and might even allow you to triple your attack payload since you actually merge with your ice when you use them." Haku could only stare at his reflections as his partner's clone continued telling him about the ideas that he had come up with to help him. Scene change. Hinata's mindscape. "Why you've been expecting me?" Hinata asked. Most of the tigers grinned as the pure white tiger said, "Of course. It was a given that Uzumaki would send you here to meet us since the ability to manifest a person's presence is so rare. Although we are quite unusual in the fact that your presence could actually be said to contain multiple aspects, or multiple personalities if you will." "Multiple personalities? But I thought that a presence defined your soul. Does that mean I have MPD?" Hinata asked. The yellow-tinted tiger snorted, drawing Hinata's full attention to it, who now that she looked closer noticed markings that looked like spectacles around the tiger's eyes. Standing up from its bed and stretching, the tiger hopped off its shelf and walked over to stand beside its white companion and said, "I can assure you that there is only one personality in this mind, Hinata. Your presence, however." Here the tiger gestured to the pure white tiger before it continued speaking, "is made from a combination of all of us, the bigger picture if you will." This time the yellow tiger's tail was the thing moving as it pointed to all of the other tigers. "We are all aspects of you. For instance, I represent the aspect of the knowledge you hold. And I'm your fighting spirit. I'm the one you call on to kick some serious butt," the green-tinted tiger said in a chipper voice that surprised Hinata with how nonchalant it was when it had seemed so fierce when it had growled at her earlier. "I'm your rudeness. You know, all that negative stuff you want to say at people but don't, and instead get even with them in even better ways," the orange tiger asked with a smirk, causing Hinata to look at it strangely. "I'm the rage that you've kept buried for so long, and what helps give you so much strength in your punches when you get really ticked at something." The red tiger growled as it opened its eyes briefly before it went back to its nap, seemingly uncaring about anything else going on in the room. "I'm your timid side. You probably hate me now," the gray tiger said as it shrunk in on itself. The green tiger looked directly across at it and said, "Hey, lighten up." This unfortunately only made the tiger shrink more on itself. The pink tiger suddenly hopped off its bed and rushed over to Hinata to rub against her as it said, "Hi, I'm your happy side." Hinata giggled as the tiger's fur tickled her, causing the fur to glow brightly for a moment before the tiger drew back and rushed back to its bed. The lavender tiger sighed and said, "I'm actually a representation of your Hyuga heritage, or more specifically your Byakugan. As such, when your presence draws on us, it gets its eyesight from me. It's also that little bit of arrogance that we all know is buried somewhere inside of you," the orange tiger said with a sneer, causing the lavender tiger to snarl. The bronze tiger chuckled before it said, "Guess I'm last. I'm many things, but mostly I'm your jealousy, greed, those kinds of things. But while most people see me as a deadly sin or two, I see myself as a guide to find something to strive for." Hinata cocked her head at that since she had never thought of it that way. She was brought out of her thoughts by the aspect of her knowledge clearing its throat. Once the yellow tiger had her attention, it said, "Now Hinata, in order for you to use your presence effectively, you must first learn to draw it out." Scene change, with Hinata and Naruto's clone. Naruto's clone looked up from the resistance seal he was making as he noticed his student's breathing patterns changed. Seeing her eyes open and looking around, he smiled and said, "So did you meet your presence's form?" Hinata nodded and said, "Yes, but in a way it's form's not form." The blonde rose an eyebrow and said, "Come again." Hinata turned her head to look at him and said, "My presence has the image of that of a white tiger, but that is made out of pieces of 8 others, each a different aspect of myself." Naruto's other eyebrow joined his twin as he said, "Well, that's different. Boss presence was just one big massive storm on the ocean. And when I say massive storm, I mean biggest damn hurricane you could imagine kind." He could barely make out the words that the thing said over the winds it created. "So what did all of these aspects tell you?" Hinata filed that interesting information away before she began telling the clone about her experience. Scene change, with the original Naruto. Naruto had forgotten how evil his godfather could be when he was getting his revenge. The man had been talking about the summoning jutsu for 3 hours straight and had promised that he hadn't even touched the tip of the iceberg. Looks like he won't actually be summoning anything until tomorrow. Time skip. The next day, 8 o'clock, Waterfall 15. It was a peaceful morning at Waterfall 15. Birds were singing and chirping at each other in the nearby trees, while the water in the river continued on its path before roaring down the waterfall into the lake below. That peace was suddenly disturbed as 6 humans suddenly appeared, causing the birds to fall silent as they tried to figure out where they came from and if they were a threat. As Naruto and his clones slipped out of the slipstream and let go of their passengers, said passengers shook their heads to orient themselves to their new surroundings. "We could have gotten here on our own power, kid," Jiraiya said as Naruto's clones all dispelled. Naruto shrugged as he began walking ahead of the group and said, "Yeah, but I wanted to get started as soon as possible. Speaking of which though, are you sure it's a good idea for me to try and summon the biggest toad I can the first time through? I mean, considering you know what I do have massive reserves." Jiraiya nodded even though Naruto couldn't see it with his head facing the other way as he said, "Absolutely. The sooner you summon the boss summon, the sooner you can get its approval. And believe me, you want that as soon as possible. It's always good to know that you have the support of the guy upstairs. So get out there and put every ounce of chakra you have into it." Naruto stopped walking to turn and look at Jiraiya incredulously as he said, "Every ounce? I don't know how much it takes yet, but every ounce? Do you have any idea just how much chakra that actually is?" Jiraiya just made a shooing motion and Naruto sighed before he began walking away again. When he was halfway between the river and the others, Naruto stopped, turned around, and took a deep breath. Then he dug as deep into his chakra stores as he ever dared and stoked the raging fire that was his body's second circulatory system, causing a roaring blue bonfire of dense chakra to appear around him that was easily 15 feet high. Back with the others, Jiraiya's eyes bugged out as he shouted out, "Wait! Not that much!" But it was too little, too late as Naruto had already bit his thumb and blazed through the necessary hand signs before slamming his hand down on the ground. A massive plume of smoke appeared covering the entire training area in a smoke fog bank that reached up to the sky higher than any of the surrounding trees and causing everybody to cough. And then a booming voice called out, "Jiraiya, what is going on? Why have you summoned all of us?" From the thick smoke cloud that was still dissipating, Naruto's panting voice was heard as he said in a loud but calm voice, "While my godfather is currently at the edge of this clearing, he was not the one to summon you. That would have been me. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. I believe you should have been alerted to my status as your new potential summoner yesterday when I signed the Toad contract." As Naruto's voice rang throughout the clearing, the smoke cloud had finally dissipated, revealing a truly impressive sight. In front of Jiraiya, Haku, and Hinata were 3 massive toads that rivaled the Hokage Tower in size, who were all facing a center point. On each toad's head and back were about 10 to 15 other toads, varying in size from the size of a grown human to the size of a horse. Naruto was currently standing on the head of the toad that was directly opposite of them, with what looked like 2 slightly larger than normal toads on his shoulders. Jiraiya's jaw dropped at how many toads Naruto had summoned, including all 3 of the big 3 and the 2 elders if his eyesight wasn't failing him. Hinata and Haku meanwhile couldn't get over how big some of the toads were. Jiraiya's jaw hung down for exactly 2.5 seconds before he realized the potential situation his godson was in, and he snapped it shut as he rushed into the clearing shouting, "Hey Gamabunta!" All of the toads, who had glanced at the blonde at the boss summon's head, turned to look at their white-haired summoner who rushed into the circle of the summoned toads. He was quickly joined by Naruto, who briefly joined the slipstream to appear by his side with the two smallest toads still on his shoulders drawing mutterings from the toads. Thud sounds began filling the air as the smaller toads began hopping off their bigger companions to get closer to the two summoner, while the bigger toads shuffled in a little closer. Looking up at the toad Naruto had been standing on, Jiraiya said, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Gamabunta. I wanted Naruto to summon you today, but I didn't realize he had so much chakra." By his side, Naruto lifted his shoulders a little and said, "Well, what did you expect? You know I constantly pulse out my chakra to negate the tunnel vision effects of the slipstream. Did you think that wouldn't affect my reserves?" "Touché," Jiraiya acknowledged before Gamabunta butted into the conversation. "As interesting as it is to see you two squabble, we must still test young Naruto for the right to summon us. Since he managed to summon me and Ma, I believe I will do the testing, Bunta boy." The toad on Naruto's right shoulder, a male if the beard on his chin was anything to go by, said. The massive toad looked down at the toad that was like a fly in comparison and nodded his head, causing Naruto to cock his head and glance at his godfather in confusion. Seeing the blonde's confusion, Jiraiya said, "Ma and Pa are the toad elders, and are actually in some ways better in a fight than a boss summons. Kind of like a Kage-level shinobi when compared to a Sannin." Naruto gave an "ah" before the toad on his left shoulder hopped off, and Pa said, "It's obvious you have Minato boy's speed. Do you think you can take us somewhere where we won't be disturbed for a while?" Naruto nodded, and in the next instant the two were gone as he once again joined the slipstream. In his place were two other blondes who quickly walked out of the circle towards Hinata and Haku to work on the tasks given to them by their creator. While that was happening, Ma turned to Jiraiya and hopped onto his shoulder as she said, "So Jiraiya boy, tell me about this Naruto person." Scene change. Valley of the End. Time in the slipstream. Roughly 30 minutes. Naruto reappeared on the head of the statue of his village's first leader. Pa hopped off his shoulder and looked around as he said, "This place will do." Looking over his shoulder, he said, "Follow me." The elderly toad then proceeded to hop over to the edge of the statue, and then off of it, earning a raised eyebrow from Naruto, who walked over and saw the toad freefall before he dove into the water, barely making a ripple near the waterfall. A moment later, a webbed hand breached the surface of the water and pushed the rest of the body up as the toad began water walking, heading to the center of the river. Shrugging his shoulders, Naruto walked a few steps back and then took a running start before he leapt off the statue and free fell halfway down. Once he fell past the statue's waist, he began spinning his body, forming wind to spin around him in a sphere reminiscent of one of his father's jutsu. The sphere of wind drastically decreased Naruto's falling speed until when it began touching the water he was barely moving. Naruto dropped the wind shell and dropped the last few feet into a crouch before he straightened and walked over to the old toad who was standing about 30 feet away. Said old toad shook his head and said, "You young people, always so flashy." Naruto shrugged and said, "You said to follow, I followed. I just didn't feel like meeting the water at high speed, belly flop or otherwise." A sort of chuckling, snort, and croak combination made its way out of Pa's throat before he got into a taijutsu stance and said, "Now then, in order for you to be allowed to summon us, you must pass my test. That test is to last in an all-out fight with me for 1 hour. You may begin whenever you're ready." Naruto cocked an eyebrow and said, "All out? Are you sure you want to do that? I mean, my dad was a summoner for you guys before he died, so you know the kind of advantage our bloodline gives us." Pa gave a wry grin as he said, "Oh, I'm quite sure, Naruto boy. Now come on. Give me your best shot." "Okay, if you say so," Naruto said in the slow, slightly dragged-out tone of voice you use when someone is telling you to do something to them that you think that other person will regret. Naruto disappeared for a moment before Pa suddenly jumped up and spun in the air before landing a backheel kick with his right foot, sending Naruto flying, who had tried to hit Pa from behind. Naruto skidded across the water, throwing up waves as he looked at Pa with wide eyes. Pa simply smirked at him and gave the universal come motion with his right hand, causing Naruto to smirk as well. Reaching into his kunai pouch with both hands, Naruto said, "Okay, now you made me curious. And that's never a good thing." Pa's smirk turned evil as he said, "Your father said the exact same thing once. I still left him black and blue. Think you can do better, Naruto boy?" "No, But I'm willing to try, Naruto said as he brought his hands out with a kunai in each hand spinning before he gripped them in a reverse grip with the blades screeching from the wind chakra they were coated in. Naruto joined the slipstream again as he rushed his small opponent determined to make him sweat a little. Valley of the End. Anyone who was around the Valley of the End at the moment would have pulled up a chair and grabbed some popcorn. Naruto Uzumaki, secretly Namikaze, was down in the gorge of the valley facing Pa, the male elder of the Toad clan, in an all-out 1-hour-long battle royal. The two had just had the opening moves and now Naruto was rushing the old Toad with wind-coated kunai in hand. As Naruto rushed the elder Toad, his blades elongated thanks to the wind chakra. He had coated the blades in before he reached his opponent and sent an uppercut slash that Pa lazily deflected with his hand as he sidestepped. The wind from Naruto's kunai formed a 10-foot-tall blade as it continued its route, cutting a small crack into the water before it sliced into the waterfall behind them. Neither of the two fighters paid any attention to that though, since Pa was already moving to take out Naruto's kneecap from the front with a punch in his Toad fist style. Some deep instinct in Naruto told him not to let that fist come anywhere near his person, so he quickly jumped back out of range only to be blasted back once again like the time Pa had intercepted him at the very beginning of their fight. Flipping forward and slamming his face on the water as he shot back, Naruto groaned slightly as he got back to his feet and spit the water out of his mouth before looking at Pa, who was smirking at him. "Okay, now I'm really curious. I know I avoided that punch of yours," Naruto said. Pa's smirk turned evil as he said, "Ah, but that's the beauty of the Toad style, Naruto boy. You never know I have you just how much you have to avoid it." Before Naruto could say anything to that, he had a Toad literally in his face as Pa launched a roundhouse kick at his face. Naruto quickly ducked and felt something trying to push his body down into the water they were standing on top of. Gritting his teeth in response, Naruto flared his chakra, causing the water to erupt away from his feet and keeping him at his current level before he rushed to Pa's side and sent in his left kunai towards the Toad's ribs, only for the Toad to once again smirk as his skin turned dark and the blade didn't even penetrate, although it did push the green one away from the blonde. "You're going to need something a lot more sharper than that to pierce my skin, Naruto boy. Even if they have wind coating them, they just don't have enough oomph. To me they feel like toothpicks." Naruto quickly disappeared and reappeared on one of the riverbanks, getting distance away from the Toad as he looked at his kunai for a moment. Getting a grin that Pa recognized from the boy's mother, Naruto said, "A little more oomph, eh? Well then, how about this?" As Naruto spoke, he put away his left kunai before he made a gesture with his left hand and manipulated the nearby water to cover his kunai's blade as he began shaping it. Pa rose an eyebrow, wondering what he was up to before the new blade finished shaping itself and Naruto blasted it with a wind jutsu, freezing it to reveal a blade. Or more specifically, a killage. "I'll have to thank Haku for giving me this idea," Naruto said as wind began spinning around the bent blade, making its killing potential even more powerful. Wind also began spinning around Naruto's entire body before it condensed to form an inch-thick armor that would prevent himself from potentially losing a limb due to his inexperience with the blade. Just because he knew a few basics of swordplay didn't mean he was a master at it. Naruto then rejoined the slipstream and rushed back at Pa, ready to potentially take off one of Pa's limbs if the Toad didn't respond properly. Fortunately, Naruto wouldn't have to explain to the Toad's wife why he was now one-handed, since there was a poof of smoke before a seemingly normal walking stick was blocking Naruto's wind-enhanced ice sword of doom. Chuckles, that was funny writing that. As the blade barely sunk half an inch into the obviously reinforced wood and Pa gave a grin at Naruto, said Blonde merely stared at the Toad incredulously as he said, "A stick? You chose to block one of the best types of cutting blades with a stick. Why use such complicated things as the blending of iron and copper, or even water and wind, when good old wood works every time?" Pa said before Naruto was suddenly sent flying out of the baseball park as Pa pushed his blade away and swung his stick like a baseball bat, hitting Naruto in the stomach as Pa had been talking. As Naruto was sent flying for the third time, Pa's stick disappeared in a poof of smoke as he shook his head and said, "Come on, Naruto boy. I know you can do better than this. Stop holding back." Naruto stood up from where he had been knocked back with a hard look on his face. Letting his wind and water manipulation skills drop, the wind around him died while his sword disappeared as the water dropped back into the river. Naruto put his kunai away as he said, "So you want me to stop holding back? Alright, I was just going to wait until halftime to get serious. But if you want it all now, then that's what you're going to get." Pa frowned as Naruto's presence began to flare and his hair began to blow around. Then Naruto made a hand sign and said, "Transform!" The blonde was covered in smoke for a brief moment before it dispersed, revealing that the blonde had used his specialty in the transformation jutsu to turn his body into his 5-year-old self, so that way he was closer to Pa's height. Pa though thought that it was just a head game, but before he could comment on that, Naruto's hair went from just blowing around to looking like it was in a full-on cyclone as Naruto unleashed the full brunt of his presence, causing his clothes to flap around and waves to form on the water he was standing on. Pa felt the smallest bead of sweat form on his brow as he felt like he was in the worst storm imaginable while out at sea, as he thought, to have such a presence while still so young. This shall certainly prove interesting. He was brought out of his thoughts as Naruto disappeared and reappeared right in Pa's face twice as fast as he had been going before, with his fist already sending Pa flying in an uppercut to the chin. Pa's eyes widened as he was lifted into the air, and he had just enough time to think, "It's not an illusion?" Then Naruto yanked on the chakra string he had attached to Pa's chin and drew him back to him. Naruto proceeded to land 7 punches into Pa's chest before he roundhouse kicked the toad in the side of the head, sending the toad crashing into the Uchiha side of the ravine. The dust hadn't even had a chance to fly before Naruto was there with his fist flying at Pa's form. Pa caught the fist as he stared into Naruto's eyes. Raising an eyebrow, Pa said, "Going all out doesn't mean only getting in 7 hits when you have the advantage of surprise like that, Naruto boy. You said go all out, not be a bully," Naruto said as his left arm rose toward Pa's elbow, hoping to break it even as the younger of the two fighters spun into a sweeping kick for the ribs. Pa quickly let go of Naruto's right hand as he jumped over the leg and said, "Ah, but sometimes they're one and the same." The rising toad then grabbed a hold of Naruto's hair and pulled it as his knee rose, causing Naruto's head to jerk forward and slam into the knee, disorienting the blonde before Pa spun and backhanded Naruto away. Naruto turned his fall to the side into a spin and landed on all 4 limbs before he was suddenly right back in the still falling toad's face, and returned the favor by grabbing the toad's beard and slammed the toad into the ground before he disappeared and reappeared on the Senju side of the river and blitzed through hand signs before he called out Wind-Water Combination. Typhoon's Rage Jutsu. A water funnel shot up from the river in front of him and bent towards Pa's form, while at the same time a funnel of wind formed and rushed Pa from the sky. The 2 funnels met at Pa's position and threw up a massive cloud of dust and debris as chunks of rock the size of Naruto's head bounced away from the crater. But when the dust cleared, there was no sign of the amphibian, and Naruto had to quickly dodge the mud dragon that shot at him at speeds that particular jutsu shouldn't be capable of. Chuckling from behind and above him caused Naruto to turn his head to where he had seen Pa land with his chakra field as the toad said, "Switching to jutsu already, Naruto boy? My, how impatient the younger generation is." Naruto grinned and said, "Yeah, well, you can't really talk considering you just sent a mud dragon at me." Pa smirked and said, "Ah, but I wasn't first." Then he pushed off and the 2 were back at it again as Pa aimed a punch at the blonde's ribs, which Naruto deflected and spun with the force to send a kick at the old toad's back, who ducked under the kick and tried to slam a punch into the leg, only for Naruto to disappear and come at him from another angle. As Naruto came in with a punch to the joint where the neck meets the right shoulder, Pa grabbed his wrist and pulled downward as he hopped up, slamming a knee into Naruto's chin, causing him to stumble backwards before he recovered and sent out a knife strike in retaliation. As all this was going on, Naruto was constantly trying to figure out how the old toad was seeming to keep up with his speed. He doesn't seem to be using chakra to move his body faster than its natural limits like Kuroda did. So how is he keeping up? Are his reflexes actually so good that he can figure out what I will do before I actually do it? If so, then that seems a little too close to the Sharingan than I'm comfortable with. Naruto had to put any further thoughts on hold as Pa's stick made a reappearance, and he began swatting the blonde with it to keep him at a distance. Naruto countered by quickly using the wind sword jutsu in order to both have something to block with and to have something to reach across the distance the 2 had. As soon as the 2 fighters both had a weapon in hand, the match quickly devolved into a deadly dance of attack and counter, block and riposte. It was 20 minutes of heavy fighting before Pa disengaged and hopped back, sighing as he once again dismissed his staff. "I've seen enough of your swordsmanship. You seem to have been more comfortable with your kunai in the beginning of this test, but you knew enough to use the wind sword jutsu without killing yourself. Now let's see your other jutsu." Naruto only gave a small nod in response before his hands disappeared for exactly 0.3 seconds, and he shouted out Wind Style, Wind Senbon Jutsu. As Naruto called out the name of his jutsu and exhaled, hundreds of invisible wind Senbon needles rocketed out of his mouth towards Pa. The toad though simply stomped his foot once and an earth wall immediately rose up to protect its creator. Naruto frowned as he didn't sense his opponent leave behind the wall, which only meant one of 2 things. Either Pa wanted to see what Naruto's next move would be, or he was going to make the most of that wall. Turns out it was the second, since Naruto saw Pa punch the wall and then all of a sudden Naruto was dodging spikes that shot from the wall in waves as Pa punched the wall 3 more times before he kicked it. As soon as Pa's foot hit the wall, Naruto wasn't dodging spikes, but boulders, 10 of them to be exact, and all of them seemed to be locked onto him. He sidestepped the first 2 before he poured wine chakra into his hands to protect them as he placed both of them over the top of the third and sprung over it before he pushed it down, causing him to go higher in the air. Flipping so that his arms were where his legs would normally be, he sliced the next 2 boulders in half as they passed under him before he attached chakra threads to all 4 pieces and sent them into the next 4 that came, turning all of them into bits of dust. As Naruto landed, the last piece of rock rocketed right towards his chest, only for Naruto to roundhouse kick it away with a chakra-enforced kick of his right leg. All of this happened in the span of 2 seconds. Even as Naruto's foot made contact with the last boulder, he was already making hand signs before he shot his hand forward with his first 2 fingers straightened like he was holding a whip as he said, "Wind style, wind whip jutsu." The whip of wind extended from his 2 fingers and wrapped around Pa's leg before Naruto jerked his hand and sent Pa flying up into the air away from the earth that was obviously his element of choice before he went through more hand signs and said, "Wind style, wind bullet jutsu." 3 spheres of air shot out of Naruto's mouth and rocketed towards Pa's airborne form. Pa's eyes narrowed before his cheeks bulged and he shot 3 bullets of water from his mouth. The 6 projectiles collided with each other, forming a slight mist before a wind dragon blasted through it and slammed into Pa's body. Naruto watched as the wind dragon pushed Pa further up into the air before it dispersed. His eyes narrowed as his chakra in the air revealed nothing but the smallest of scratches on Pa's skin. What's more, as soon as the dragon dissipated, Pa made 2 hand signs before a miniature dragon of the toad's own creation burst out of Pa's mouth, this one made out of water. The smaller-than-usual dragon roared at Naruto as it barreled down at him before Naruto backhanded it with a wind-coated right hand, causing it to burst apart. As Pa landed on the ground in a crouch in front of him, Naruto sensed chakra pulse from the toad into the river as the toad made the same 2 hand signs and a much larger water dragon rose out of the river on the toad's right. Naruto's eyes flicked over to the yellow eyes of the water dragon as it let out a growl before it launched itself at the blonde before Naruto disappeared. The dragon slammed into where the blonde had been, throwing up a debris cloud in a similar manner to the dragon that Reina had used in her preliminary fight. The only difference was when the dust cloud cleared, the dragon was still there as it looked around for its target. Or at least it was still there until Naruto appeared right above its head, already slamming a wind-enhanced axe kick into its head which caused it to disperse. Even as Naruto appeared and kicked the water construct, he had already blazed through hand signs and shouted out, "Wind style, wind wolf pack jutsu." Naruto landed in a crouch as the air around him shimmered before it swirled into itself to form a 5-member strong pack of snarling wolves that growled at Pa. Naruto frowned at Pa and said, "If you expect me to take this fight seriously, then I must ask you to do the same, sir. Attacking me with such underpowered jutsu is making me think that you'd rather not be here." Pa's right eyebrow twitched and he said, "Younglings these days, always so disrespectful. Very well, you want my techniques at full power, then you shall have them at full power. Earth style, Toad Golem Jutsu." Right after speaking, Pa gave a low but obviously heavy hop. As soon as he hit the ground again, the ground gave a deep shudder before Pa began rising up on what seemed to be a rather wide column that seemed to be over 20 feet wide. That notion was quickly dissuaded as Naruto saw the column curve and a pair of closed eyes rise above the level of the ground before they were followed by nostrils and a wide mouth. The face was then followed by a chest that was easily 20 feet tall before finally what Naruto assumed were bent legs that were at least 50 feet tall finally came out of the ground. As the 100-foot-tall statue that looked vaguely like a toad lowered its head and groaned opened its eyes, Naruto sighed and said, "Now who's being disrespectful? Sending something so clumsy looking after me." Wind style, Tornado's Fury Jutsu. The effects of Naruto's jutsu became apparent as right after he called out the jutsu's name, the wolves that surrounded him dispersed into their base element, and the wind began whipping about, making his still ongoing presence's effects look like nothing but what a small handheld fan could do. Naruto immediately crouched down and anchored himself with chakra, as after the first 2 seconds of jutsu activation the wind really kicked up and a tornado easily 300 feet tall and 90 feet wide instantly whirled into existence. As soon as the tornado came into existence, it began grinding against the front of the stone golem, easily carving small crevices into it within seconds. Those crevices quickly became holes as chunks of the golem were ripped out. Pa, meanwhile, was having to anchor himself with chakra even as Naruto upped his chakra output and doubled the tornado's size and height. The rim of the tornado shot past the edge of the cliff face with no signs of stopping even as it began carving into the solid rock. Pa's earth construct groaned as the wind began slowly lifting it into the air before it suddenly exploded into over 1,000 pieces as the wind proceeded to shred it. As Pa felt the wind trying to turn him into Swiss cheese, he looked down to where Naruto was still anchored to the ground and saw him look up at him and make 2 hand signs before he ended on Tiger and said, "Fire style. Campfire's light." Naruto spat a small ember out of his mouth which shot into the funnel, instantly setting the funnel ablaze. Scene change. Waterfall 15. Time: 8:30 with Hinata. Hinata followed Naruto's clone through the trees as they tree-hopped to a place with a bit more privacy further upriver than the clearing where Jiraiya had started to talk with the second Toad Elder and Haku, and the other clone had began working on trying to get his mirrors the right shape. As they traveled, Hinata thought about the progress she had yesterday, or rather the seeming lack of progress. Knowledge had told her that presences could be considered a special branch of genjutsu in the very loosest terms. This was because when a person used their presence, it mentally manipulated their opponent in small levels to intimidate them. But the key thing that separated presences and genjutsu from each other was the fact that presences had absolutely nothing to do with chakra. It didn't matter if you were the greatest shinobi alive or the poorest peasant. If you ever found out how to tap into your presence, you could use it to manipulate what others around you were feeling on various levels. Of course, most people did this on an unconscious level, which is what most people described as the person having a certain air around them. The really hard part was consciously focusing on it and manipulating it to the point where you could turn that air on and off. Once Knowledge had finished explaining just what exactly a presence was, it went on to say that consciously manipulating a presence was practically impossible to just figure out, and that even those who were considered the best actors probably only did so unconsciously. To consciously manipulate one's presence was practically unheard of in some parts. But this was really only because so few people managed to begin the process of drawing on it. And that is what Hinata had been trying to do. She had tried to look into herself to find her presence, so that she could draw it out to the surface of her mind like Knowledge had told her to, but whenever she thought she might have something, it would disappear. The only thing that kept her from despairing was the fact that Naruto's clone didn't seem too upset. He had said that it had taken the original a month to even be able to understand his presence in his mindscape, and something told him that Hinata would be able to consciously manipulate her presence in a much shorter amount of time than the blonde, since she could actually understand her presence when she first saw it. Hinata wasn't convinced, but would worry about that later, since today they were going to put on the full body resistance seal that the clone from yesterday had made. She was pulled out of her thoughts as the clone said, "This should be far enough." As the clone hopped down to the riverbank and pulled out the scroll that contained the currently compressed resistance seal, Hinata joined him on the ground as she looked around. The area they had stopped in wasn't a clearing like she had thought they would go to. Instead, they had stopped in an area where the trees grew just a little bit closer than usual, looking like they almost formed a solid wall. Looking at the river whose path they had followed, Hinata noticed that it had slowly widened the further upstream they had traveled. Where it was 10 feet at the waterfall, the river here was now 20 feet wide. She was once again drawn from her thoughts by the sound of ripping paper as the clone ripped the part of the scroll with the seal on it away from the rest before he turned to Hinata and said, "Please turn around and lift your shirt." Hinata's face turned bright red as she thought about how what the clone said could be implied, but did as she was asked. The clone rose an eyebrow at the blush before he placed the 1 foot by 2 foot piece of paper on top of Hinata's spine and made a half-hand ram sign with his left hand even as he kept his right on the seal and said, "Seal." The compressed seal flashed blue for a second before it began glowing constantly as the ink of the seal spread off the paper in lines of sealing code that traveled over Hinata's body as the seal unfolded itself, spreading vine-like lines down Hinata's limbs and wrapping around Hinata's front and upper neck to her face before it stopped glowing. The seal remained visible for another 5 seconds before it seemed to sink into her skin, leaving no trace that it was ever there. Naruto's clone took the now blank piece of paper off of Hinata's spine from where the seal had both unfolded off of and faded through it before he ran a chakra-infused finger down where one of the lines were testing to see if it responded or not. Getting a query in response. The clone nodded his head and stepped back as he said, "All right, you can lower your shirt now, Hinata." Hinata breathed a sigh of relief and allowed her shirt and jacket to fall back down before she turned back to the clone and said, "Now what?" She would never admit it to anyone, but the feeling of the seal spreading across her body had felt worse than having someone else placing something on your back and holding it there. The clone smiled and said, "Now I teach you how to use the seal, and then we begin running back to the others so you can get used to it." With Haku, 8:30. Again. Haku's hands blurred through the familiar hand signs as he followed the clone of his partner's orders. The water from the nearby river and puddles from previous attempts shot up and formed a ring of dented mirrors surrounding the two. Once the ring finished forming, they all gained a slight sheen, showing their readiness to be used. The blonde clicked a timer and looked down at it before shaking his head and said, 35 seconds for a 50-foot ring. I know this is only the second day, but that is still not nearly fast enough, Haku. If we're going to have you be able to successfully take out groups of people in rings that are around 100 feet or more in size, then we're going to have to pick up the pace. Again. Haku mentally broke apart his mirrors before he went through the hand signs again, trying to make the ring of unfamiliar mirrors faster. He had a few factors working against him. The first was obviously the unfamiliarity with the new shape of the mirrors. He had been using flat panels for the shape of his mirrors for so long that it took that extra bit of concentration and time to make sure he used the new shape. He also had distance and shape of the jutsu working against him. With the dome, he had a shorter range to spread the chakra around and had a simple gem shape to use as the final look to go for. With the ring, he had to stretch his chakra further and come up with a collective shape that he wasn't all that sure actually had a name that described it. Haku put those thoughts on hold as he put his hands in the last sign and manipulated his chakra again. Scene change. Waterfall 15 time. 9:15. Naruto kept his vortex of fire active for 15 seconds before he cut the flow of chakra from the fire-enhanced wind jutsu and allowed the tornado to disperse into stray embers. Panting from all of the combined chakra he had used so far during the day, he idly watched as the stray embers floated to the ground and he saw Pa's form drop to the ground. The toad's skin was dark again, showing that he had used that unknown defensive jutsu to keep himself safe. Too bad it didn't work for his cloak though, since the toad was currently patting out embers that were still in the badly burnt cloth. Naruto cocked his head and said, "So have you seen enough in this test yet?" Pa cocked his own as he put a hand to his chin in thought. Grinning, he said, "One last test, I think. You've shown that you can handle one boss summon-sized creature on your own. I'd like to see if you can handle more than one." Naruto rose an eyebrow, not liking the sound of that last sentence. But before he could ask how Pa planned to do that, Pa made 10 quick hand signs and hopped 8 times on the ground. Naruto was expecting another golem to appear, but he was shocked when 10 of the massive earth constructs shot out of the earth in 2 5-figure-wide rows instead of slowly rising like before. He was even more surprised when 5 water golems formed out of the river all in a row, with the middle golem no more than 100 feet from Naruto. Naruto stared at the golems as he allowed himself 10 seconds to wonder how the hell the old toad was doing all of these insane jutsu with so few hand signs before he dropped his transformation. As the resulting smoke cleared, Pa was treated to the rather rare sight of Naruto unsealing a small bag that held exactly 20 soldier pills. Naruto then proceeded to do an even rarer thing and reached in and took exactly half of those pills before he popped them all into his mouth in one go, causing Pa's eyes to widen at the apparently suicidal move. Remember that one soldier pill is rumored to allow a shinobi to fight for 3 days and nights straight. Imagine what 10 all at once would do. Naruto's chakra had taken 2 rather large drains today. The first was when he had used as much as could be considered safe, when dealing with the blonde to summon all of those toads. And then when his chakra had been slowly but surely refilling, even with jutsu flying around, he had formed a massive tornado that had put his massive reserves back down into the 5% range. But as soon as he swallowed the pills, Naruto felt his reserves shoot straight back up to 100%, maybe even 110%, making him smile as he said, "You know, I've always wanted to try this, but I've never actually been in a situation that was actually appropriate." Transform. Smoke erupted from Naruto's form, covering him as it instantly shot up into the sky past the height of the golems and even past the rim of the valley itself before it stopped at a height of at least 500 feet. I believe that the valley is around the 350 mark. The smoke hung in the air for 10 seconds, obstructing Pa's view before it began to slowly disperse and revealed a sight that left Pa's jaw wanting to fall to the floor. Whereas before Naruto had used his unique transformation skills to seemingly turn back time until he looked like a 5-year-old, he now looked closer to a 24-year-old. Or at least he would have if you could see him at a distance, seeing as how his new and rather impressive 500-foot height made it impossible to see all of him at once from where Pa was. Naruto turned his head to look down and grinned as he said, "You wanted to know what I would do against multiple boss summon-sized opponents? Well, if they were all spread out and could easily move around, I'd just put at least 10 explosion tags on each body in key areas before they could do too much damage. But why do that when they are all grouped together in this valley, and I can indulge in a childish fantasy just this once?" Before Pa could respond to that, Naruto's massive form disappeared before he reappeared in the air over one of the stone golems in the middle of their formation and allowed gravity to take over. The unfortunate golem was instantly reduced to rubble as Naruto's new weight was brought down on it. The other toad golems all began moving with surprising speed towards Naruto in retaliation, only for the blonde to have immediately dropped into a sweep kick when he had landed, taking out 2 more golems as well as digging out a wide cave in the cliffside before he slammed a palm into another golem's torso, sending it into the one behind it and turning both into rubble. Naruto stayed in his crouch as he observed the remaining 5 stone golems and the 5 water golems that had by that time joined the fight. The 10 elemental constructs formed a ring around Naruto and rushed him all at the same time, causing him to smirk as he crossed his arms and formed 2 wind swords before he spun around in a circle and slashed into the constructs, disrupting all 10, while at the same time slicing into both cliff sides, leaving 2 long lines of empty air where there had once been solid stone. Dismissing his swords, Naruto stood up and looked down at Pa, who hadn't moved from his spot, and said, "So have you seen enough?" Scene change. Waterfall 15 time. 10 o'clock. Jiraiya and Ma were sitting across from each other as the two continued to talk. Further downstream near the waterfall, Haku continued to constantly make and dismiss his mirrors, trying to get his speed up to the expectations of his partner's clone. Meanwhile upstream, Naruto's other clone was having Hinata run through the katas for the gentle fist style in order to further get used to the new resistance seals, while at the same time making suggestions about how to best take advantage of the Hyuga clan heir's flexible agility. The 2 sages' heads suddenly snapped to Jiraiya's left as an exhausted Naruto left the slipstream and appeared with Pa on his shoulder. Haku and Hinata both saw him appear as well, but were quickly brought back to their tasks by their minders. As Pa hopped off of Naruto's shoulder, Jiraiya said, "So how did he do?" Pa sat down next to his wife as he said, "Young Naruto boy seems to be quite well off considering how few years he can actually claim as his own. I have no problems allowing him to summon any members of the Toad Clan to help in battle should he ever need us." "Well, that's good," Jiraiya said. "Indeed," Naruto agreed as he plopped himself down next to his godfather and looked towards where Haku was once again making a large ring of mirrors. Turning his head to look behind him, he saw his other clone moving Hinata's right arm a little as she performed part of a kata that Naruto recognized from when she was holding off Sai's Tanto. Jerking his head towards Hinata while jerking a thumb to Haku, Naruto said, "They seem to be coming along well." Naruto got 3 nods in response before Jiraiya smirked and said, "So how much property damage can the village bill you to?" "Ow!" Naruto rose an eyebrow as both Pa and Ma jumped forward and whacked Jiraiya in the head before the blonde said, "The village won't actually be able to charge me considering we were at the Valley of the End. But to answer your question, Pa here needed to do some impressive earth manipulation to fix all of the damage we ended up doing." "Ow! You mean all the damage you did, Naruto boy? I wasn't the one who transformed myself into a 500-foot version of myself just to take care of a few golems," Pa said as he landed from hitting Naruto in the head. Now it was Jiraiya's turn to raise an eyebrow as he turned to his godson and said, "Transformed? I thought that the transformation jutsu was just an illusion. How could that help?" Naruto smirked before he said, "Maybe this will put things into perspective. Transform." The blonde was covered in smoke before it cleared, and revealed a blonde fox smirking up at Jiraiya before it hopped up on the Elder Toad Summoner's shoulder and said, "Still think this is an illusion?" Jiraiya's jaw dropped as he slowly reached a hand up and felt the fur on Naruto's body, even as he stuttered out, "A real physical transformation performed by a human?" Jiraiya's eyes rolled to the back of his head as all of the potential applications for such a jutsu overloaded his brain, and Naruto hopped off his shoulder as he fell back and hit the ground with a thud. Turning around to look at his godfather, Naruto frowned at the perverted grin that slowly made its way on his face, and the blonde shook his head and said, "I don't even want to know what's going on in that sick mind of his right now." The 2 toads behind the temporarily transformed blonde could only nod as Jiraiya let out a perverted giggle as he thought about how his godson's sexy jutsu was less a prank and more of a godsend. Time skip. 6 days after preliminaries, sunrise. Hidden Rock Village main gate. Inoki of the Twin Scales took a moment to take one last look at his village before he turned to his Jounin commander and said, "I leave the village in your capable hands, Commander." The commander nodded and said, "I'll make sure everything is running smoothly while you're gone, sir. Enjoy your trip." Inoki nodded before he turned to his granddaughter and said, "Make sure you keep up Kuratsuchi. It's 2 days to the Leaf Village by flight on average, and I plan on getting there before sunset on the 2nd day." Kuratsuchi nodded before Inoki tapped his granddaughter, and the 2 began floating before they shot into the sky before they leveled off at 500 feet and rocketed towards the Land of Fire. Scene change. Hidden Leaf Village 7 days after preliminaries. 2:45 a.m. Like most places, it was fairly quiet at night in the Hidden Leaf Village. The only activity that usually took place was the night patrols of ANBU groups and civilians working night shifts or medics working at the hospital. Tonight was a little different in the fact that 2 more people were awake talking as they stared at a third person who never slept as he stared at the moon. As the Sand Village's Jinchuriki once more wasted another night of boredom while others slept, a block away his Jounin sensei was having a meeting with his contact as they stared across the roofs of the lower buildings separating them from the higher building where Gaara had perched himself. So it's true, I see. He really does never sleep, Kabuto said as he adjusted his glasses, causing them to momentarily flash. Baki grunted before he said, should we really be meeting face to face like this? I heard about what happened at the hospital a few days ago. Hell, the whole village heard about it. You screwed up when it came to retrieving that Uchiha brat, and now the whole village is after you. If I'm caught talking to you, it would not look good. Kabuto waved his hand as if having the entire Leaf Village on the lookout for him was no big deal as he said, it wouldn't matter since anyone who found us like this could easily be taken care of. And to tell you the truth, I allowed myself to be discovered. What? Why would you do something so stupid? Baki asked, looking at him wondering how someone could be so stupid. Kabuto shrugged and said, well, to be honest, I was curious to see how the leaf would react, and it did not disappoint. But enough chit-chat, here are the plans for the Kazekage. Baki took the proffered scroll from Kabuto, although he frowned as he said, you take too many risks, Sound Nin. If you expose the plan before we are ready, then we will have to pull out. The sand will not make a move until the sound attacks. That is the Kazekage's will. A block away in an alley, a figure stiffened as he thought the sound is going to attack and the sand is helping. I have to warn the Hokage. The figure turned ready to jump away only to cringe as he disturbed loose gravel. Back with the other 2, Kabuto gave another dismissive wave as he said, of course it is. You just be ready to do your part and your village will be able to once again proudly claim to be one of the strongest in existence. By the end of the first round of the Chunin exam, this village will be burning. Oh, and don't worry about the spy. I'll take care of him. No, I'll handle it. After all, it's just a leaf mouse, Baki said as killer intent slowly filled the air. Shit! They heard me! The figure thought before he crouched ready to jump away. But before his knees could unbend, he suddenly seemed to disappear into thin air. Not more than a few seconds later, Baki appeared in front of where he had been and looked around. Hearing a crashing sound, he tensed as a trash can rolled towards him before he relaxed as a cat walked out of the darkness and looked into the now open trash can. Just a cat? The oncoming invasion must be making us paranoid, Baki thought before the cat looked up at him and started hissing at him. Baki suddenly paled as he now noticed a ribbon around the cat's left ear. Even in the Sand Village, there were stories about the demon cat that belonged to the Fire Daimyo's wife. And Baki wasn't interested in finding out if the stories of it being able to take on Jounin were real or not. The cat, however, seemed to have other ideas as it began to let out a low mewl before it launched itself at Baki's face. Baki grunted in pain as the cat's claws tore into his face before he threw the cat off of him and took off back to the hotel muttering about damn cats while Tora ran back into the alley. As both figures disappeared, a blonde figure stepped out of the darkness and thought, never thought I'd ever be glad to have placed a tracking tag on that cat for anything other than knowing when to hide my seafood ramen. Looking towards the Hokage Tower where a single light was still on, the figure frowned and thought, it's a good thing I found this meeting, or else we could have probably lost a Jounin tonight and we would have had no confirmation that Sound and Sand are actually working together on this. Hopefully the old man will know what to do. The blonde then disappeared as he continued his self-regulated patrol, hoping to find out where the traitor went. Time skip. 16 hours later, 6:45 p.m., Hidden Leaf Village Barrier Squad Headquarters. Alarms suddenly ripped through the quiet atmosphere of the Barrier Squad's headquarters as the barrier that surrounded the village in a sphere suddenly detected a breach. The squad commander rushed out of his office towards the bowl where the projection of the barrier was and said, "What's going on? Why has the main barrier alarm sounded?" "We're picking up an unauthorized breach, sir. It seems to be 2 people. But it's weird, this says they're flying," one of the attendants said as he pointed at the projection where ripples were appearing at the top of the sphere. The commander's eyes widened as he said, "There's only one person that I can think of who can fly and would be confident enough to come here with only one other person. I better tell the Hokage to expect company." Putting action to words, the commander rushed back into his office and slapped a button on his intercom that had a link directly to his village leader's office. As soon as he heard his Kage's voice come through the speaker, he said, "Sir, the primary barrier has just been breached by 2 people coming in from the air. I believe it is the Tsuchikage and an escort. I see. Well, this is unusual. Thank you, Commander. Now if you excuse me, I believe I should go greet old Inoki. Scene change, Hokage Tower roof. Sarutobi walked out onto the roof of the tower and could immediately hear the sound of hundreds of the village's citizens talking to themselves in confusion. And it was no wonder either, he thought as he looked up and spotted what to civilians looked like two large dots, but to shinobi who were trained to see farther were actually his counterpart and a girl who, if he was not mistaken, was Inoki's granddaughter, slowly floating down towards the tower. It took a while, but 5 minutes after they first breached the barrier, Inoki and Kuratsuchi touched down on the roof. Sarutobi gave a respectful nod of his head as he said, "Inoki, it has been a while." "Indeed it has, Sarutobi. Unfortunately, this is not a pleasure trip. May we speak in private?" Inoki asked as he returned the nod. "Of course, please follow me," Sarutobi said before he turned and walked back to the stairs that led into the tower. Inoki and Kuratsuchi followed at a respectful distance as the three walked through the hallways of the building until they came to the Fire Shadow's office. Once all three shinobi were seated, Inoki said, "I won't waste your time with small talk, Sarutobi. I came here to not only confirm a rumor that I had my granddaughter look into for myself, but to also determine if there might be a potential threat to my village. I'm afraid that this threat might come from both inside and outside my village if this rumor is true. I'm assuming this rumor has something to do with one of my jounin. A certain blonde jounin, to be specific," Sarutobi said as he folded his hands on his desk and leaned forward. Inoki nodded and Sarutobi sighed before he leaned back and touched a seal on his desk, pushing chakra into it, causing it to glow. 2 seconds later, the fastest shinobi alive was suddenly in his office, standing in front of his desk at rigid attention with absolutely no signs of how he got there, causing Inoki and Kuratsuchi to jump in surprise as Naruto said, "You summoned me, Lord Hokage?" All hints of playfulness was gone since the Hokage rarely, if ever, used the jounin emergency summon seal to just summon him. "I did, Naruto. We have an important guest who is interested in meeting you," Sarutobi said as he gestured behind him, even as he activated the security seals around his office now that everyone was there. Naruto paid no attention to the flashing seals, having seen them in action before, as he turned around, but his eyebrow unconsciously rose as he saw who was sitting behind him, or more specifically what the person was wearing, and he said, "Well, this should be interesting. Lord Tsuchikage, I hope you had a pleasant trip." "Humph, as pleasant as can be expected considering the reason for the trip," Inoki said as his eyes narrowed while he studied the blonde in front of him. Naruto nodded before he went to stand behind his village leader as Sarutobi said, "Well, now that Naruto is here, what do you say we get this meeting over with, so that way we can get to more pleasant things?" Scene change, Waterfall 15, 2 hours later. Naruto left the slipstream in the training ground where his group had unofficially claimed for the month's training with a sigh as he thought, "This is why I hate politics. It was relatively easy enough convincing the Tsuchikage that I had no plans whatsoever to go on a killing spree against his village unless provoked, since I really don't. But the members of the Rock Village Council are sure to blow everything out of proportion once my heritage is finally revealed to the world. At least now we know that Inoki won't take sides during the invasion if it happens while he's here." Shaking his head at how whoever first came up with the idea for village councils must have been the biggest idiots of the world, Naruto walked over to where his godfather was looking over a couple of experimental seals Naruto had made that he had wanted to know could work. He was sure that Jiraiya would be interested in how the meeting went, and then afterwards he planned on working on a new technique he had thought of during the meeting. Time skip, 7 days to final. Naruto and Haku watched as Hinata tore through a group of water clones the two boys had made. The tweaking of the gentle fist style and Hinata's increase in speed was apparent as she decimated the clones almost as soon as the two could make them. Her hands were a blur to anyone not high chunin or above, and any Hyuga would be staring at their clan heir in shock at how different her fighting style was from their own. Whereas most Hyuga's fighting style was stiff and could be considered extremely formal, Hinata was flowing from one strike to another, looking like a dancer as she continued fighting. Jiraiya was standing next to the two originals with a notebook out, taking notes that were surprisingly not perverted in nature. He was running a critical eye over Hinata's form as she fought and writing down where she had left an opening more than once. There were surprisingly few notes on his notebook, though, which was good since the original Gentle Fist could easily be picked apart if you knew the style as well as Jiraiya did from fighting next to Hyugas during the Third Shinobi War. "She's definitely going to kick some ass during the finals," Naruto said, smirking as Hinata spun around, slicing through a ring of clones with chakra shooting out of pointer fingers in a thin but long blade. "You taught her well, kid. I just can't wait to see everyone's faces when she lets loose with that presence of hers," Jiraiya said with a smile. "Indeed, Hinata will do very well against her cousin now that you have made the gentle fist style actually fit her own fighting style," Haku said as Hinata took out the last clone. "Let's just hope we can do as well with what comes after," Naruto said as he looked towards the village with a small frown. Jiraiya snorted as he said, "Trust me, we'll be fine. With the advanced warning, we are already preparing for the invasion. And any summons that my old teammate uses to get through the walls will have to deal with the toads first." Naruto nodded before he walked over to Hinata and said, "Good job, Hinata. Now I want you to take a break from training for the exams. This doesn't mean I want you to stop training altogether, just enough to keep you in fighting shape. We don't want you worn out before your fight." "Yes, Naruto-sensei," Hinata said as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Jiraiya smirked and began to turn a page in his notebook, but a wind senbon ripped straight through the new page while it was still in the air. Jiraiya looked up to see Naruto holding another wind senbon in one hand and pointing somewhere at Jiraiya's body with the other, right between his legs to be more specific. Jiraiya paled and said, "I'll behave." Naruto nodded and let the senbon disperse before he turned back to talk to Hinata some more. Haku meanwhile chuckled before he walked away from the group, wanting to get more practice in with his new mirrors. Time skip. 7 days later, Chunin Exam Stadium. The stadium where the final exam of the Chunin exams was packed. Nobles and common folk alike had flocked to the village to witness these fights, and you'd be extremely hard-pressed to find an actual seat as all but one of the contestants stood in a line in front of Naruto. Hundreds, if not thousands of people had placed bets on the outcome of each of the fights that were about to start. But the main topics of conversation were about the prodigy of the Hyuga clan fighting its clan heir, and the last Uchiha fighting against the Kazekage's son. Naruto looked at the line of genin and thought, it's a good thing Uchiha's fight is last. Knowing Uncle Kakashi, they're going to be holding out appearing until the last second. Although considering what's going on, and Orochimaru's interest in the brat, that might be for the best. Up in the booth that was reserved for village leaders and their bodyguards, the professor sat in his seat waiting for his counterpart from the land of wind to come. On his right side, Inoki sat in a seat that had the Rock Village symbol on it while Kuratsuchi stood beside him acting as a bodyguard. As he looked over the milling crowds, Sarutobi thought, so many people to see the next generation do their best to knock each other senseless. It really is a wonder how we haven't completely destroyed this world with our violent tendencies. The Land of Fire's ninja commander saw white at the corner of his eye, and he turned with a smile as he saw his counterpart reach the top of the stairs that led to their booth. Grinning, he said, "Greetings, Lord Kazekage. I trust your trip here was pleasant?" "Pleasant enough, Lord Hokage, but I must admit, I'm glad the Chunin exams were held here this year. A trip to the land of wind at your age must surely be a difficult task. The same must be true for you as well, Lord Tsuchikage." Inoki humphed and said, "You seem to be forgetting who you're talking to, Lord Kazekage. This trip for me was nothing." Sarutobi let out a bark of laughter as he said, "And I'm quite certain I could have made the trip as well. Please don't think about burying me yet. I still have a couple of years left in these old bones." The Kazekage's eyes narrowed the barest of increments as he said, "I'm sure that is quite true, old friend. Still, don't you think you should be considering a replacement?" Inoki became more focused on the conversation even as Sarutobi grinned and said, "Perhaps, but we can discuss that after the exam. For now, it's time to start." With the conversation over, Sarutobi stood up from his seat and walked over to the edge of the balcony, causing everyone to quiet down when they saw that the Hokage was about to speak. "Ahem, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guest, welcome and heartfelt thanks for gathering here in the village hidden in the leaves for the Chunin selection exam. We will now begin the matches of the final round between the 14 candidates who advanced in the preliminaries. Please sit back and enjoy." The crowd erupted into cheers as Sarutobi went back into his seat. As he did, the Kazekage turned his head slightly so that way he could see his counterpart with both eyes and said, "14 candidates? It seems you're missing one." Sarutobi humphed and said, "I'm sure I have the boy's sensei to thank for that. But don't worry, I've taken steps to make sure he gets here in time." "Wonder what those were?" Inoki humphed again and said, "Any brat who doesn't show up on time doesn't deserve to be promoted regardless of who his sensei is or if the kid has some bloodline limit. If a shinobi is unreliable, he or she shouldn't be put into a position of power." Sarutobi hummed but didn't say anything. Down in the arena, Naruto turned around and took out a folded piece of paper and unfolded it as he said, "This is really just a formality since I'm sure none of you are dumb enough to actually forget who you're going to be fighting. However, if you need to make sure when your fight is, now is the time." He allowed the genin a moment to confirm when their matches would be before he folded the paper and put it back into his vest as he said, "Now, listen up. This is the last exam, so make sure you give the best showing you can. Out here, you're not only representing your team, you're representing your village as well in front of hundreds of potential clients. Make sure you keep that in mind during your fights. That said, the landscape here may be different, but just with the preliminaries, there are no set rules except that you fight until one of you dies or admits defeat, unless I determine that a clear winner has already been decided, in which case I'll stop the fight. Everyone understand?" He got nods from most of the genin, so Naruto nodded to himself as well and said, "All right then, Hinata and Niji Hyuga, you two are starting us off. The rest of you proceed to the waiting room outside the arena." Once all of the non-participants of the first match had cleared the arena, Naruto held up a hand and said, "First round of the Chunin exams. Niji Hyuga, are you ready?" When Niji nodded, Naruto said, "Hinata Hyuga, are you ready?" Getting a second nod, Naruto's hand flashed down as he said, "Then you may begin."